Yes. La fille sont chorus, on se regarde et on passe en là. Ok.
to be important to the rest of the day. So by using the web browser on your phone and going to pollev.com/GSSW, there's a little tank card on your table that gives the instructions. You'll be able to participate in posing and answering questions throughout the event. So I'll give you a head start on that. Thank you all so much for being here. We're really, really excited to see so many people from the community, students, system professionals that are really engaged with the issue of how we solve the problems of incarceration and problems throughout our criminal justice system. I'm Shannon Sliva. I'm an assistant professor here at the Graduate School of Social Work. I teach a restorative justice course here, and I conduct research on emerging criminal justice policies, especially those that use restorative dialogue and community engagement. And today's sessions mark the second presentation in GSSW Science for Action series. So this is part of a national initiative from the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare to address important challenges for the field of social work and for all of our communities. Obviously, today we're addressing the challenge of promoting smart decarceration. The next challenge series that we'll have will be in April, and it'll focus on solving the problems of homelessness, so we hope you'll mark your calendars for that as well. I'd like to take just a quick moment to provide an overview for the day. We will start off in just a moment with some opening remarks from Representative Pete Lee, and he's taken a tiny little segment out of his day at the Capitol to be with us, so we're really happy for that. Then we'll have a keynote talk by Carrie Pettus-Davis, who is with Washington University in St. Louis, and she heads up the Incarceration Initiative for us nationally. We'll then have two different panels of local experts that are involved in implementing strategies on the ground that address incarceration from a variety of angles. And those sessions will be panel sessions that are moderated. At the end of each one, you'll have an opportunity to engage in dialogue, to pose questions, and to hopefully get your questions answered about some of these strategies being implemented. We know that probably not all of your questions will get answered. We're going to be moving quickly through the time, but we have a networking reception that opens up at 4:30, and we hope you'll stay for that just to have some snacks and drinks with us and to visit with our guests and our presenters. A few logistics. So on your tent card on your table are instructions for technology, so it should get you on the Wi-Fi. It should enable you to participate in the polling using your cell phone. And also, it will give you the address for the online program and the event materials. So many of the speakers have handouts that are available on your tables. There's not copies for everyone. We tried to save a few trees. So there's electronic copies of all of those handouts and more materials about the Smart Decarceration Initiative at that website. You can also participate in the conversation on Twitter or on social media with the hashtag #Science4Action. So I think the fact that you're here today suggests that you also agree that we're at a really important juncture for addressing criminal justice issues in our nation and in our state and local communities. For the past decades, our approach to treating the problem of crime and violence and drug use has been to enforce more and tougher penalties. And this has come at a really high cost to our communities and with not very good outcomes. 2 out of 3 people released from our prisons return within 3 years, and by 5 years that goes up to 4 out of 5. Meanwhile, as many as half of the crime victims whose cases are prosecuted are dissatisfied with the outcomes or don't feel that their needs were met by the criminal justice process. And we also increasingly recognize that incarceration does not occur in a vacuum. So a growing body of research is showing that incarceration has a damaging effect on community and family health. Children of incarcerated parents are more likely to live in financially unstable homes, enter the criminal justice system, the child welfare system, and become incarcerated themselves. And neighborhoods with higher incarceration rates exhibit higher rates of mental illness. So today you'll hear that we have strong evidence that we can do better with regard to criminal justice policymaking, and I hope that you'll also see that many of our leaders in Colorado are making strides in this direction and are really putting science into action. Our dean here at the Graduate School of Social Work, Dr. Amanda Moore McBride, has really been the heart of the Science for Action series and has been a visionary for us in terms of creating a space for scholars and researchers in this school to connect with our communities in meaningful ways and to offer science solutions that have actual impact on the problems that our communities are facing. She's a scholar in her own right. She organized a recent think tank on the rise of social innovation in higher education and how to best apply the Academy's human capital to addressing entrenched social issues. She's also authored or co-authored more than 70 books, journals, articles. She'll want me to stop talking about all that now. So I'll bring her up to give you some welcome and further opening.
So Shannon deserves her own acknowledgement. No heart here. The heart is out there. I work for the faculty, and it is really clear to me that we have exceptional faculty members. I just want to give you a little factoid about Shannon. She's only been in Denver for 2.5 years, and I want you to look at the room. It's full. There's 200 people here. She's on to something important in terms of issues, and she has made incredible community connections. So Shannon, you deserve a round of applause for organizing this event. Thank you. I'm delighted to welcome you to the University of Denver, which has as its mission to be a great private university committed to the public good. And I'm proud to say, as the Dean of the School of Social Work, that we might be leading the way on campus. In addition to a series like this, I have to say our faculty, to a person, across all 47 of them, are committed to social justice, they are committed to understanding disparities, and they are committed to their science and their teaching doing something about those disparities. So this series is natural for us to host because it is about taking inquiry and innovation and putting it into action. And I am delighted that so many of you are interested in hearing more about the latest in terms of policies and programmatic approaches. These are wicked social problems that got to be wicked because of people. And people are going to find the solutions, and you are part of that. So thank you for making the time to be here today and to commit yourselves to learning more. This series has as a format each series, so there's 12 grand challenges, and we're going to be dealing with 3 grand challenges every year. And we're following the same format in each one of the sessions, where you're hearing from a national expert on the issue who will frame it nationally. And then we come down to Colorado, and we look through the lens of this state in terms of what the issues are and how they're being addressed. And then we come back out, and we have a range of panelists that represent the practice community, those with lived experience in the area who help nuance the issue and the data to help us understand how we can apply it and improve the conditions, not just here in Colorado, but I have to point out that we're also live streaming and we have people joining us from all over the country. So the challenge really is not just to hear more information and get some good food and hang out with some cool people that care about issues that you do, but that we actually end the day with a greater understanding of the issues and a greater understanding of what our role can be in doing something about it. So I look forward to today's session and hearing from a range of experts. I will say that I do feel a bit of urgency in introducing State Representative Pete Lee. He actually has a little bill coming up this afternoon, and we need to get him out of here so he can go deal with that, and he'll say a few words about that. We've asked him to be here for several reasons. The first being that he is one of the most stalwart leaders in Colorado around criminal justice. He has dedicated his life and his political career to reforms. And they include reforms around restorative justice, the division of youth services, the prohibiting of the use of solitary confinement, promoting transparency and reforming drug sentencing, parole, bail, and criminal records expungement. I appreciate that we have leaders like Representative Lee who are willing to commit to an issue, recognize all the systems that are connected to it, and then commit to changing those systems. We are all fortunate to have a leader like Representative Lee. Please join me in welcoming him.
This is a terrific room full of people who are going to make the changes that need to be made to make this system work as we know it can. So thank you for being here. Instead of taking your materials out, I'll take my own. First, thanks to Amanda Moore McBride and Shannon for inviting me to join you here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about some of the work that we're doing and to learn more about some of the work that you're doing. So with that in mind, after meeting with the man who killed her 3-year-old son in a drive-by shooting, Charlotta Evans said, "I got all of my questions answered. I am completely satisfied. Now I can think about Kayson's life. Before, all I could think about was Kayson's death." From an offender in the Department of Corrections who, after meeting with his murder victim's mother, said, "I have never put myself in the victim's place, and hearing what she was forced to deal with made me feel and instantly face the issues that my selfish behavior caused. It made me uneasy, but the lasting impression of it made me want to live my life as a better person." From a mom whose son was killed in a drunk driving accident after meeting with that young man, I came away finally with a feeling of completion, understanding, relief, and peace, like a huge boulder had been lifted from my heart. So when I read these statements from offenders and victims of the most horrible crimes, I ask, why has Restorative not moved from the margins to the mainstream? When I read, as Shannon said, that we incarcerate more people in the United States than any other country in the world, that half to 2/3 of them go back to prison, I ask, why has restorative justice not been adopted as the first option in the criminal justice system? We need to change the trajectory of this juggernaut, and make no mistake about it, the trend to mass incarceration and over-incarceration is a juggernaut. The legacy of tough on crime remains strong, and now the flames of fear are being stoked at the highest levels. But to do so, we need to make systemic and fundamental changes. So we have to take on mandatory minimum sentences, habitual offender, 3-strike rules, sentence aggravators, indeterminate sentences, the incarceration of drug addicts and mentally ill, and all of the other vestiges of the war on crime and the war on drugs. We need to talk about decriminalizing drugs and mental illness and move to community treatment options, which we know work for both better than prison-based treatment programs. The Hawaii Hope model of sure and swift graduated sanctions for probation and parole violations, which incorporates motivational interviewing to get people back on track, is supported by evidence-based pilot projects in Colorado. We have to end the money bail system that incarcerates millions of poor people around the country, but have proven ineffective as public safety strategy or to motivate people to come to court. Instead, we need to use evidence-based, validated assessments like the Colorado pretrial assessment tool to get detainees out of jail, back to their families, back to their jobs, and back into their communities. This afternoon, I'll present a bill to the legislature for a text-based court reminder program to advise people of their court dates. Your dentists and your doctors do it. It's intended to reduce failures to appear. If we can reform money bail, expand pretrial release based on risk-based assessments, and enact text-based court date reminder programs, it's entirely possible that we can cut our local jail populations in half. We have to be bold and innovative. In my 7 years in the legislature, I've sponsored and passed 27 criminal justice bills, some for adults, some for kids. We added social workers to the public defender's offices around the state and improved outcomes for kids and resulted in fewer juvenile incarcerations around the state. Last summer, I proposed a bed cap on the Department of Corrections, and Colorado's legislature actually imposed bed caps on the Division of Youth Services years ago. If we don't build them, they will not fill them. Last year, we prohibited the jailing of nonviolent 10 to 12-year-olds in the Division of Youth Services. We barred the doors. This session, I have a bill which could significantly depopulate the Department of Corrections. For nonviolent offenders who reach their parole eligibility date and have no Code of Penal Discipline violations in the last year, it creates a presumption of parole eligibility which can only be overcome by evidence of a significant risk to public safety found by a majority vote of the entire parole board. Last year, I sponsored a Justice Reinvestment Crime Prevention Initiative. I would modestly say one of the most innovative bills that the legislature has seen. We will take $5 million from the parole system by shortening the time technical parole violators are returned to prison. And we will give that money, half of it to North Aurora, half of it to Southeast Colorado Springs, to local justice planning teams. This program is unique in the nation because rather than reinvesting criminal justice money back into the criminal justice system, we invest it back into the communities, in school dropout prevention, family re-engagement programs, loans, apprentice training programs, or whatever the local community team of 25 people decides. Things that will prevent crime in their own local communities. The creative innovator of this program is on a panel this afternoon, Christy Donner, and you should give her a round of applause when she talks about this crime prevention initiative. I was just carrying her water on that bill. Einstein once said, "No problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it." We need to see the world anew. Consistent with this principle, I proposed that the most effective decarceration strategy is not sending people to prison in the first place. Diversion from jail and prison. Stop the inflow. We know that incarceration is a risk factor for future incarceration. Juvenile justice advocates say that the best thing you can do for a kid in the juvenile justice system is get them out of the juvenile justice system. So 3 years ago, I sponsored a pilot program for pre-filing diversion of juveniles to restorative justice, based on the New Zealand model, which prioritizes restorative justice as the first option. The programs gave district attorneys the discretion to divert to restorative justice any juveniles who were charged with any offense, from a petty offense to an F3. And if they succeeded, the juveniles would avoid having a criminal record altogether. We have evidence. With over 1,000 kids participating, we had a 95% success rate. Success being defined as attending a victim offender dialogue, reaching agreement with the victim to repair the harm, and actually doing all of the things that they agreed to do in the plan for reparation. 3 years later, the recidivism rate, 9%. An average juvenile justice program has a 30% juvenile recidivism rate. In schools, we know that children who are expelled or suspended are on a fast track to drop out. This isn't hypothesis or speculation. We know this from the data. To empower kids, to keep kids in school, I sponsored House Bill 1032. It allows schools to adopt restorative justice programs as the first option to deal with misbehavior in the schools. And we know that it works. In 2 years, 5 Denver public schools used restorative justice for school misconduct. All schools showed reductions in out-of-school suspensions and expulsions compared to their prior year's total, and many students, in addition, showed significant reductions in absences, tardiness, office referrals, and they even got increased parental involvements. When kids stay in school, they don't go to prison. We will continue our efforts and encourage your initiatives to help guide our efforts. If you think we cannot change the fundamental order of things, that the things we propose will only happen when hell freezes over, remember, it snowed in Las Vegas in December. Thank you.
Being the tall guy, I always have to do some adjustments here. Well, good afternoon. I'm Jeff Jensen. I'm the Wynn Professor for Children and Youth here in the Graduate School of Social Work, and working closely with Dean McBride on the Science for Action series. And it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Carrie Pettus-Davis. I wanted to note first, however, some of you are standing in the back. There are some chairs if you want to move up. And I understand there'll be some chairs brought in if necessary, Abby. And maybe we made it now. Okay. If you have a chair next to you, maybe you can do that. Well, great. Thanks again to Representative Lee. I think he had to duck out for his insightful comments, and certainly one of the more committed people in our state to advancing criminal justice reforms and innovative policy responses. So we're very appreciative of him being here today, as we are of all the speakers that we're very excited to hear from this afternoon. So it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. Carrie Pettus-Davis. And it's especially fun for me and delightful for me. I've followed Carrie's career for some years now and watched her develop into really an impactful, influential scholar in the area of criminal justice and in particular decarceration. So it's really fun to have her on campus today. Carrie is an assistant professor in the Brown School of Social Work at University. She also serves as director of the Institute for Advancing Justice Research and Innovation at the Brown School. And along with her colleague, Matt Epperson from the University of Chicago, Carrie leads the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare's Grand Challenge on Smart Decarceration. And this is the organizing theme around the series that we're putting on in the next several years and that you'll hear about today. So together, having involvement in this Grand Challenge initiative myself, I've watched Carrie and Matt really do some very impactful things in only 2 years of the initiative. They've hosted 2 national conferences on the topic of smart decarceration at the University of Chicago and Washington University. In 2017, she and Matt published what is very likely the first comprehensive book on smart decarceration. So they're making some very significant headway in a very short time. Carrie focuses her research on decarceration in 2 ways, really through policy reform efforts and also by developing and testing behavioral interventions that are delivered to offender populations. So she's particularly interested in the ways in which policies and practices can be transformed to reduce racial, economic, and behavioral health disparities in the criminal justice system. And through intervention research, she's partnered with community agencies, community partners, to test strategies that aim to enhance social support, reduce substance abuse, respond to trauma experiences among justice-involved adults. She's published over 50 academic publications, 2 books, and very impressively, she's often called on from the media and public policymakers in Missouri and across the country really to speak on issues and comment on policies regarding decarceration. So I think the research that Carrie is doing really embodies the Science for Action series that we've created at the school. Her work emphasizes the development of new knowledge, the application and translation of knowledge to policy, and to improving conditions for individuals and society as a whole. So this application piece really lies at the heart of what we're trying to get at in the Science for Action series, and indeed in the whole Grand Challenges initiative sponsored by the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. So please join me in welcoming our colleague from Washington University, Dr. Carrie Pettus-Davis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Yes. Okay. I might move down the stage. Anyway, it's great to see you all. I'm very excited to be here in this room today. I love the School of Social Work, so I'm glad to spend an afternoon here. So what I want to do, I'm going to go over what I want to talk about today. So I want to talk just briefly on the context for smart decarceration. I'll define what smart decarceration actually means. I want to go over some evidence that the era of smart decarceration is actually here. Talk a little bit about the grand challenge for social work, promote smart decarceration, how it's structured, the types of work that we're doing. And then I just want to wrap up with the unique role for social work in this area, given that I'm at a School of Social Work with half the audience, almost half, 40% of the audience being students. That's a very helpful chart, by the way. So first, I want to start with a picture. So what is this picture? What? Yeah, this is the picture of what people refer to as the era of mass incarceration. That really started around the 70s, and if I was closer to that picture or I had a pointer, I would show you that this picture actually also maps on to my life course, both personal and professional life course, which is quite unfortunate in many ways. So I was born around the area where there's a 7 in the number, I'll just say that. And I became a professional working in the area of criminal justice and criminal justice reform and reentry in some numbers that have 9s in them. So as you can see, though, there was a huge spike after the numbers that start with 9s in incarceration in the country. So as you can probably imagine, as a social worker during this time period who recognized the significant social injustices that were occurring in our criminal justice system, it was a very frustrating period of time. And in fact, as a social worker, I had to develop a motto for myself. And that motto was, if things have changed 50 years after I'm dead, then my work will have been a success. Because it was that frustrating. And then, just a few years ago, I started looking around me and noticing some trends and looking at some patterns and one of my little, oops, sorry. Well, the other orange box in there is era of smart decarceration. I don't know why it's showing up. But I started looking around and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't have to wait until 50 years after I'm dead. The time is now. Things are actually changing now. The era of criminal justice reform, of smart decarceration is upon us, and I better help try to do something about that from an academic perspective, which is what led to a lot of the work that is now informing the Promote Smart Decarceration Grand Challenge. So A lot of problems happened in the meantime. Right before we started to see this curve going the other way, we became the world's largest incarcerator in the world. Yeah, I said world twice, but you know what I mean. So we also saw some other problems come out of this that I'll talk about in a minute. But what led to mass incarceration, right? This is an important thing to ask ourselves if we're trying to think about how do we get out of this situation. So there were so many factors that led to mass incarceration. Tough on crime, approaches that both parties adopted, rise in violent crime, a crack cocaine epidemic, war on drugs, racially biased criminal justice practices collided with mandatory and determinate sentencing, deinstitutionalization of psychiatric hospitals, also happened at the same time that community-based supports were underfunded. There was criminalization of poverty and other public health issues. There was a distrust of the government, which led to some of these mandatory and determinate factors. So there were so many things that I actually made a chart of this at one point in time. Actually, not me, one of my students made a chart of this. There was numerous policies that contributed to mass incarceration, numerous societal factors that contributed to mass incarceration, which means that our approach to smart decarceration is going to be equally as complex and multifaceted. I want to dig in just for a minute on disparities. Dang, I might have just given you the answer to this question. So the question I want to ask the audience is, criminal behavior is not the greatest predictor of criminal justice involvement in the United States. That's empirically supported. What is? Poverty. What else? Disassociation, racism. Did I hear somebody say that? Is it? Right. So economic, behavioral health, and race disparities. So I'm going to start with economics. So we know that many people are in jail before they've gone to trial because they cannot afford the money to get out. We also know that once a person experiences incarceration, they're substantially more likely to be driven into poverty or further into poverty and have significant reduced lifetime possibility of getting out of poverty. Many of the people in this room know about the significant behavioral health disparities in the criminal justice system, where hovering around half to 60% of people have some type of mental health challenges that are incarcerated. Substance use disorders are 3 to 6 times higher in the general population. And we have we've used the criminal justice system to respond to behavioral health and public health challenges. The final piece, and this is the piece that people might hear the numbers on the most, is that there's people with black and brown skin are significantly more likely to experience criminal justice involvement. And I want to stop on that for a second because what many audiences automatically go to is that there's differential rates of crime or criminal behavior, and that is not empirically supported at all. What is empirically supported is that people of color are more likely to come into contact with law enforcement despite no differences in criminal justice behavior. When they come into contact with law enforcement, people of color are more likely to be arrested. When they're arrested, they're more likely to be charged. When they're charged, they're more likely to be sentenced. When they're sentenced, they're more likely to be sentenced more severely. And when they figure out what the punishment is, they're more likely to go to jail or prison. And when they get out of prison, what happens? Again, they're more likely to come into contact with law enforcement. These are not opinions. These are empirically supported facts at state levels, at national level, et cetera. So there is a significant role of racial equity and addressing racial disparities to being able to achieve smart decarceration. So I wanted to pause on that for a moment and let you know that as we think about criminal justice reform or smart decarceration, we have to recognize that reducing racial disparities are within the criminal justice system are not only critical to having decarceration, but also to achieving racial equity within our country. And the way that we'll know in context of decarceration that we're nearing on racial equity is when the color of your skin does not predict the likelihood that you'll become involved with the criminal justice system. In another way, in order to achieve racial equity, we have to really think about race, and this is for the researchers in the room, not being an independent variable in a model, right? Not being something we look at, oh, how does this experience differently by race? But rather that we have to say, how are our innovations and our practices reducing racial disparities in criminal justice contact? We have to strip away policies and practices that lead to racial disparities. I'm going to give you 2 examples of that. Many assessment tools, although it's good to think about the use of assessment tools, many of our assessment tools are racially biased because they're based on static factors like criminal history and age at first involvement. Given what I just described about law enforcement arrest, who is more likely to have a criminal history? Not because of differences in criminal behaviors. Another unfortunate and surprising study that we saw recently was around ban the box initiatives. So we saw in New York and New Jersey that ban the box initiatives actually made it harder for people of color to get jobs instead of making it better. So we have to not only say, are these good ideas? Do they logically make sense? Are they impacting the overall population? We have to see if that is being disproportionately experienced. The positive benefits are not being, if they're not being received by everybody, then we're not doing something right. And I'm going to get back to that in more detail in just a little bit. I want to talk to the skeptics in the room for a minute. I'm quite used to talking to skeptics. So I'm going to present some arguments from the skeptics, and I'm going to go ahead and say that you're wrong. And I have the mic, so I can. But so many people said that decarceration or the reducing of incarcerated populations was occurring because of the Great Recession. When did the Great Recession end? 2009. And the incarceration rates are still occurring. Many people said that declines in incarceration rates are temporary. We're still seeing declines in incarceration rates around the country. Many people said conservatives are never going to go for this. We're seeing increasingly number of conservative lawmakers of red states passing sweeping criminal justice reforms that are targeted at reducing the incarcerated population. There are substantial media exposés and public outcry around concerns of civil rights violations, human rights violations, the moral responsibility to give people another chance. Many people said when Jeff Sessions was put into his position that we just, might as well throw up our hands and give up because we've got tough on crime right back in the federal government. Granted, Jeff Sessions does do tough on crime approaches, and we also know that he's out of sync with the rest of the states, where the majority of incarceration occurs. And we're also seeing little glimmering of hope that Jeff Sessions is now publicly making statements around the need for prison reform and positive reentry experiences of people. I also want to point out that almost every state in the country has passed more than one criminal justice reform since 2010. And since 2008, we've actually seen 36 states reduce their imprisonment rates. And in many of those states, they've been able to decline the population by 15 to 20%, and this is happening in all sorts of regions in the country. A really exciting report just came out by the Pew Center, which found that those states, Alaska's a little blip there that messes up my image, but I haven't redone the graph yet. No, I'm just kidding, I wouldn't do that. But anyway, what we're seeing is that many of the states when they dropped their imprisonment rate, their crime rate dropped too. Why would that be the case? Because all data shows us that incarcerating people for any amount of time over 48 hours actually makes things worse. It's criminogenic, crime producing, not if I don't want to say the fancy word for that. So this leads us to the recognition of the profession of social work, saying when we're thinking about our grand challenges, we see positive progress here, but we also saw all these factors that contributed to mass incarceration. So we need to organize around this grand challenge, which is what we termed promote smart decarceration. And what we really are responding to is this fact that the way that we do incarceration in the United States is out of sync with the rest of the world and has resulted in significant economic, human, social cost for our society. It hurts our ability for individuals and for people to move forward. And we also recognize that we can undo this problem that was created by humans, as Amanda pointed out. We are humans that can undo it as well, but it's going to require a proactive, a cross-sector, and evidence-driven approach. So let me give you the 3 simultaneous outcomes of what Smart Decarceration seeks to achieve, and what we argue, if anything happens that's less than this, then we have not actually achieved decarceration in this country. And that is one, the obvious one. We need to substantially reduce the number of people that are incarcerated in our jails and prisons. That we can do that and still not promote social justice or civil rights if we don't also redress the existing racial, economic, and behavioral health disparities among those who do become involved in the justice system. And finally, we can't just reduce disparities and reduce the population and then all of a sudden seeing upticks in crime or still struggling communities. So we also have to achieve public safety and individual and public well-being, and it is these 3 things that have to be our major focus of every type of practice and policy innovation that we're going for. Will they lead us in this direction? And we need to evaluate whether they're leading us in that direction as well. So we have 4 concepts that guide the Promote Smart Decarceration Grand Challenge, and that is we have to change the narrative on incarceration. When is incarceration an option, or shouldn't it be our last resort? We have to think differently about who is incarcerated. All these different ways that we've done our practices aren't leading to the most violent or most threats to public safety being incarcerated. They're leading to people who are sick or homeless or struggling with behavioral health problems winding up in our institutions. We can't just think of one segment of the criminal justice system. We need law enforcement, prosecutors, public defenders, jails, prisons, community corrections, all to change the way that they do their practices. We have to implement transdisciplinary, which is a fancy way of saying a bunch of different people from different backgrounds come up with new futurescapes, not focused on our current landscapes. So transdisciplinary policy and practice innovations. And we need to employ evidence-driven strategies. One of the ways that I disappoint audiences most is they're waiting for me to talk about the silver bullet, but unfortunately, while we were spending tons of resources incarcerating people, we were not spending tons of research figuring out what our evidence-based strategies are, so we might just have to work with evidence-driven for a little while to figure out what's most effective. So thank you to Jeff for mentioning the co-leadership of the Promote Smart Decarceration Initiative. So myself and my colleague at the University of Chicago are leading this Grand Challenge. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the Grand Challenge so people can get a better sense of what's actually occurring in this work. And for our Grand Challenge Network, we've divided up into working groups, and these working groups are really focused on advancing research to promote smart decarceration, advancing social work practice, helping to train existing and new practitioners to think in using promote smart decarceration concepts and outcomes. We have a policy working group that helps us keep an eye on the national policy landscape as well as local policy landscapes, and an education working group that says, you know, if we're going to expect social workers to engage in this work, we got to think differently about how we train. You'll see on the screen that multiple universities are represented, as is our major practice organization in social work called the National Association of Social Workers, and the Congressional Research Institute on Social Work Policy. I left the word out, work there, sorry about that. And Jamie is on our practice group. Where'd you go, Jamie? Jamie Yoder from Colorado State University is here, who is one of our leaders in the working group, so thank you so much for your service and leadership. So what these working groups are doing is they're trying to figure out for the profession, in order to advance these concepts, what are 3 key focus areas that we need to start with? What are the key activities that need to occur in order to advance work around those focus areas. And then who is responsible for doing that? What's our timeline? And what's our deliverables? So anybody who's been involved in community organizing before knows that if you don't address these key components, it's really easy for things to get a little unwieldy and out of control. So I wanted to give you an example, and you probably can't read this, but I can, and I'll read it out loud to you, of what the research working group has identified as their 3 key areas of focus. And that is fostering strong research collaborations that maximize resources, expertise, and collective impact across social work researchers, building the evidence base for best decarceration practices and policies, and then synthesizing, highlighting, and promoting the contributions of social work research in the area of smart decarceration. And Shannon, is this going to be available on that website or whatever? Okay, we can make the slides available so you can read in some more detail about what some of the core activities of this group are, and then we're also soon going to be publishing the working plans for each of our working groups. So what we're really trying to do with this grand challenge is making sure that our leadership represents researchers, practitioners, and policy professionals. We want to make sure that we have, a commitment to exactly how we're going to pursue this work forward. We're defining various levels of engagement for a range of stakeholders, and we're trying to come up with a strategic action plan that has very clear outcomes that can be communicated and get feedback from the general public as well as people within our profession. So I'm going to wrap up talking just briefly about I have 10 minutes left still? Huh. I have more time for questions, which is even better. I talk fast, as you may have noticed. So we're going to wrap up with the unique role for social work in this work. So social workers, I already have all the answers on the board, but I want to hear a few people's perceptions on what the unique role of social work is, not only from social workers, actually from anybody in the audience. What's unique about social work's contribution to this work? You're going to have to start talking soon. Anybody? Yes?
Focus on social justice.
Yes, the focus on social justice and reversing mass incarceration. Social justice is a key driver. What else? Yes? Yes, being trained in order to think about and implement from a multi-level perspective, from individual differences and experiences all the way to policy levels. What else? This work is directly aligned with our values, right? With social work values and principles and the pursuit for civil rights and human rights and social justice, like was already mentioned. And then also social workers take a multifaceted perspective. We've also been on the outside of this issue for about 40 years. And we can bring a fresh perspective to the efforts that are occurring. And we're naturally inclined to work in collaboration with a whole range of stakeholders within and outside of the criminal justice system. So I'm going to stop there and say thank you and want to discuss questions, but I do want to specifically thank Jeff and Shannon and Amanda for bringing me here, and thank all of you for being in the room. Are we doing questions now? Oh, respondents and then questions. Okay.
Actually, Carrie, so you could stay up here because there might be questions for you. So why don't you sit over here? Sorry. Thank you.
Wait, I have to take the mic back just for a second. Shannon's also on the policy working group and doing leadership work there. So thank you, Shannon, too. I forgot to say that.
Thank you. So I'm going to invite our 3 respondents to come up and join us on the stage. And I'm going to give a brief introduction of them so that you'll know who you are. The first is really actually one of my dearest and most dynamic community partners, Nancy Lewis. Nancy, will you come up? You could just take a seat here. So Nancy is the executive director of the Colorado Organization for Victims Assistance. And while she's been with COVA since 1994, she had many lives before this one, in which she was also a social worker, a teacher, worked on the revitalization core with race relations, ran an alternative high school and adult women's program, many, many things. And now she is known as a formidable force in the legislature and at the Capitol, and also just a really empowering advocate in our community for crime victims and survivors.
I started when I was 2.
Next, after Nancy's comments, will be Dr. Brandon Matthews, so you can come join us. And Brandon is really on the leading edge of some new and interesting innovations with regard to reentry, and especially looking at reentry from a systems perspective and a community perspective, like how organizations manage these tasks. So he's been a practitioner leading residential community correctional facilities, and he's also a researcher. He's published a ton of peer-reviewed scholarly articles, and he recently delivered a TED Talk on the Mile High stage, so he's basically famous. If you like TED Talks as much as me. And he's part of the Alliance for Criminal Justice Innovation, which is a future-focused organization concentrating on the impact that people, leadership, data, and culture have on successful reentry. Last but not least, and definitely in alphabetical order only, is Beth McCann. And Beth is our Denver District Attorney since 2017. She is the first female district attorney in Denver's history. And has really been a champion for women, but also for progressive criminal justice reform and restorative justice in the state. Prior to taking the role of district attorney, she was a 4-term state representative, a role in which she was a champion for criminal justice and healthcare reform. And she's a founding member and former president of the Colorado Women's Bar Association. So I've asked each of these kind of local experts in their various capacities to respond to Carrie's talk and to this issue in general of how we go about the task of decarceration. So they'll each take just a few minutes. Your handy timekeeper is right down here, stage right. And then I will open a polling screen also, where you can start to submit your own questions, and you can up and down vote other questions that you see on the screen. You can do all that in just the web app on your cell phone. It's very user-friendly to use at the site. But first, I'll let you guys take it away. Nancy, would you go first?
Sure. Dr. Carey, I was all set to disagree with everything you said. and what I found is that there's nothing that I can disagree with. But what I would say is the component that is often lost when we talk about prisoners, prisons, people being in jail is the other side of the equation, and that's crime victims. And sort of the same kinds of information that you're presenting with people who are incarcerated exists on the crime victim side. And so I would hope that in your studies that crime victims are part of the equation. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Am I supposed to say, or are we going down, or what's the order? Are we having conversation?
Yeah, are we having conversation?
Sure. Do you want to?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. I really appreciate that and think it's critically important. And there are some growing movements of involving individuals that represent crime victim organizations in thinking about decarceration work. Another thing around this, and I would love to hear your reaction to this, that I'm trying to sort through is the incredibly gray line between who's solely an offender and solely a crime victim. And many of my research and just personal experiences with people is over 90% of the people in prison, both men and women, to be binary about it, but they have experienced some type of victimization themselves, either from their peers or from their families or in the community. So I just kind of wonder, like, how do you think about that?
I think about it a lot. In the criminal justice system, the line is at the crime that's committed. Before I did this work, I dealt with high school dropouts in Bed-Stuy, and if we were, I guess my dream is a little bit larger, but I haven't figured out how to get there. And if we were really, really going to deal with change, it would be at the very front end when, we know, being a teacher, you know when you're teaching kindergarten kids that are not getting the support and are taking the wrong direction at a very early age. And so if I were really going to think about prevention, it would be that we go back to ground zero and we deal with, gangs know how to enlist other gang members, and it's by creating a sense of belonging. And yet we've not created that in our schools as well as gangs have done that. We know how to turn that corner. We have just not spent the resources to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
I didn't think I was going to agree with you.
Oh!
So it's a nice surprise.
Well, I actually started my reentry work working specifically with crime victims.
Well, and it's real interesting that when you talk about a social movement, the crime victim movement came out of all the movements you're talking about. Yeah.
In the 90s.
Yeah.
Yep. That's when I started too. Yep.
Hi. Well, I take a little bit different perspective as a practitioner working in the system. There's kind of two dominant paradigms or domains that I see when it comes to decarceration. The one that you talked about a lot, the policy area. There's sentencing reforms, the habitual criminal statutes, decriminalization, and the whole nine. But when we start engaging in that area, we basically think of a pitcher of water, and we start pouring it into the other domain, which is practice. And with all of the change that happens in the policy and front end, we have to make radical change in the practice. And that ultimately creates these challenges that we see in all areas of the system. And I'll throw community reentry agencies into that just for efficiency's sake. I don't know that I equate them exactly as I would to a justice-based entity, but I'll just call it the system for now. So when you're working in this larger system and you're dealing with all these decarceration initiatives on the front end, the practices that we start engaging in have to become evidence-based. They have to become evidence-driven. And right now out there's prevention, there's post-incarceration interventions that we have, and a lot of what we're doing, we don't know whether or not it works. We don't know whether or not the outcomes we're getting are a result of the program or the practice itself, or are they a result of the way we're implementing that program or practice. Are we just not good at it, is kind of one of the things I ask myself a lot. So a lot of the work that I do and that me and my colleagues do is to really evaluate whether or not we're adhering to the science that tells us how you implement and adopt programs, how you do it, culture within your organization, facilitative of the things that you need to be doing in order to get good outcomes. And there's these pillars that we talk about often, the people, leadership, data, and culture. And it's interesting that we're here at a School of Social Work because one of the pillars is about people and the way that you select individuals to work inside of your agency to deliver these practices that we expect to get good outcomes. The current situation, I don't know that we are really, outside of the social work world, I'll say that, I don't know that we're really thinking through how are we selecting individuals to deliver these practices that are an anathema to many of us who started in the system as enforcers. So it's really critical that we identify what is the correct individual to be delivering this intervention or this practice. How are we culturally facilitating their ability to do so? Are we creating an organization that embraces those things, or are we creating an organization that finds that to be antagonistic and then pushes the very people we want there out of the organization? So we do a lot of focus on helping organizations, whether they're in the community based out of there or they're justice organizations, really understand and recognize that without these pillars supporting everything that you're doing, you'll never really know if the outcome you're getting is because the thing didn't work and you need to innovate, or is it because we just weren't doing it the right way. And I'm interested to hear Dr. Pettus-Davis' thoughts on innovation versus replication. We can replicate programs all day long, but that doesn't get us any further down the road. We have to innovate to create new programs, and we never know if a new innovation is going to be effective until it's effective or not. So I'm interested how you see that fitting into the decarceration movement.
Yeah, I think that's a great, easy question. I'm joking. It's a hard question. I want to comment on one thing and then come back to that, but because I really appreciate the two things you underscored. Was one is to look at the intersection of both policy and practice. And I already forgot the other one, but I'll remember it in a minute. So I'll talk about the intersection of both policy and practice. I think one of the things that practitioners really experience is that we've got a host of public policies, 45,000 some public policies around the United States that work to exclude people from communities that have experienced incarceration, and that works in direct conflict to principles of support and reentry programs. So there has to be this both and approach to that. In order of answering your question about innovation and replication, one of the things in the criminal justice world, we talk about this criminal justice system like it's one massive system that looks the same everywhere, but it's actually incredibly localized. So a lot of people say we don't have one criminal justice system, we have 200 criminal justice systems. And that's the same for service providers that may just be serving people getting out of the justice system. So I think that there's a push and pull that requires nuance in that when we have an effective practice that works in one community when implemented the right way, it's important to identify what those key ingredients are of the practice. And what if when you remove one of those key ingredients, it's going to take away the effectiveness. And then outside of those key ingredients, allow for some innovation, allow for some localization, and then see if it's impacting people. It's impacting people the same way, right? But I think we can't think about research and practices as totally transferable or a one-time experience. It has to be constantly evaluative. And one of the things that my research team really works on in collaboration with partners and funders is to try to constantly push against current scientific methods that require us to do research so long that it takes 17 years to adopt research findings into practice, and that's not an exaggeration, that's actually an average. And so we're looking at how do you challenge our existing notions around methodology to be able to identify research findings, adapt practices in real time, while still being able to speak to the integrity of our findings. So I could talk about that for a long time. Did that answer your question?
It did. Okay. It's good to. I'm somewhat of a pariah in academia because I downplay the utility of an RCT in human-based interventions. For the reason you just said, is that doing an RCT here doesn't mean that practice is now somehow evidence-based in Pueblo, Colorado, right? It just doesn't mean that.
Right.
So I think the utility of those things has run its course in this space if we're thinking about what does the future look like for decarceration initiatives and the innovations that are going to lead us there.
The way that they're currently conducted, yeah. Absolutely. I try to do RCTs using the real-time model, actually. But again, a very different methodology that's informed by all sorts of other people than me. All right.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people interested in this issue. So I've been in office as the Denver DA for about a year now. And one of the things that I talked about in my campaign was criminal justice reform and how could we do things a little bit better in Denver. So we're working on a number of things that I think will impact and have impacted the number of people that are incarcerated, at least in the Denver County Jail, City Jail, and ultimately in the prisons. But I want to talk a little bit about what Nancy mentioned, which is really to get a handle on this, we've got to put more resources into prevention. And that's where people like you come into play, because you are learning the expertise, getting the expertise to work with families, to work with people who are beginning to get into that track. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is, I think, for people like you, if you're interested in this, to get involved in the prevention in and working with people early on. Those who are identified by the teachers, by the school systems as really struggling and having issues. What we're doing, I've reorganized our juvenile unit in my office to make it a more desirable place for DAs to be. Any of you who are in the system may know that for DAs, the juvenile court has traditionally been a place they don't want to be because it's filled with social workers. So they start in county court learning how to try cases at the misdemeanor level, so the penalties aren't as great, and if they lose a case, it's not the end of the world. And then they typically go to juvenile court where they try felony cases, but again, the penalties aren't as great. And then they can move into district court, which is felony trial court. So many of them, the goal is to get in and out of juvenile court as fast as you can, so you don't have to deal with social worky type things. But I have a different approach. I think juvenile court is probably our most important court. And I required the chief, I appointed a new chief and required her to give me a 5-year commitment, which is very unusual, and I required 3 other deputies to make 3-year commitments. So they are becoming very aware in the juvenile system. And I think that is having a difference. And they also, unfortunately, many of these kids repeat, so they get to know these kids and their family situations and can really, I think, address juvenile crime in a more enlightened way. And then the other big issue for me is the mental health, behavioral health involvement in our criminal justice system. And, people give varying statistics, but many people in our criminal justice system have behavioral health problems, and that includes mental health and substance abuse. And we don't do a very good job in our criminal justice system of dealing with those issues. And we can blame the criminal justice system, but honestly, people who deal in this area sometimes don't have a lot of alternatives. So a parent who has a child who's out of control and dangerous calls the police because they don't know what else to do, or there aren't other resources available. Well, the police that's not really what they want to be doing. So, those people often end up in our county jail sort of cycling through on lower level crimes. So we have started now meeting with the public defender before people get advised of their crimes, and we are trying to weed out, I hate to use that term because some of them are marijuana offenders, but trying to move people out of the criminal justice system so that they don't spend time in jail for substance abuse problems. We're trying to look at more treatment. And we're working with our pretrial services, thank you, Greg, who will be speaking to you later, to really identify people who don't need to be held in our county jail. And in Denver, I'm happy to report, our numbers in our city and county jail are decreasing dramatically. I should have brought that slide, but we have seen a decrease, and I think part of it's what I'm doing, but the other piece that's really exciting in Denver, and this is something you guys should think about doing, we have a co-responder program in Denver which partners social workers, mental health workers with police officers. And they actually respond to the calls if it appears that they are mental health calls. The dispatch will send the clinician with the officer, or they may be in the car with the officer already. And the statistics from that program are really staggering. I just was meeting with some of them today, and last year they probably went to 1,100 calls, and of those, I think it was only 2% that got arrested. So they are able to say, this is something we can deal with. Let us talk this person down. Let us get them to mental health. treatment. Now, the police, when this first started, they weren't real happy about this. You know, they're cops. They don't want social workers riding along with them. But now they're clamoring for it, and so the program is going to be expanded soon. We hope. We only have 6 co-responders right now, but the goal is to get to about 22 so they can cover the whole city. So these are the kinds of things that I think in the system we can do. And I think we are looking at these kinds of innovative programs which use the skills that folks like you have. We've started a restorative justice program, and I think Pete Lee probably talked a little bit about restorative justice. But we've started that now in our juvenile world, and we are probably going to expand to adult cases as well. So I know I'm talking a lot, but I mean, it is hopeful. You know, we have some really good things going on in Denver and good people involved.
Thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for all of the respondents? I really appreciate you guys being here because I feel like it adds some context for us to think about how this big national and structural thing actually looks on the ground and in our communities. I don't want to say I'm surprised, but I'm really excited about how many people are participating in my poll right now because I didn't know how this was going to go over. So you guys have been doing a great job and using your technology. And we have actually a couple questions that have a lot of votes that I would like to give Carrie a chance to answer. And the top one on this list is, how are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people involved in the Smart Decarceration movement now?
Sure. Lots and lots of ways. So I'm going to start with my own work because this is a #1 priority issue for me. Is the voices of people who've experienced incarceration. So with my research centers and the Smart Decarceration Initiative, we have what they define themselves as a community liaison board, and that's comprised of entirely formerly incarcerated individuals. And I don't do anything without it going in front of them first. So not a research idea, not an assessment tool, not an interview question, not a program or policy idea, without meeting with the board about it first and getting their input and shaping and feedback. And the way that we engage with incarcerated individuals via that board too is I get calls and letters from prison a lot, and we always make sure to respond and engage in some kind of dialogue around issues that we're currently pursuing, and their own ideas that people who are incarcerated are coming up with too. So that's in my work in the Smart Decarceration Initiative, which forms or informs the Promote Smart Decarceration Grand Challenge. On a national level, there are many groups that are advocacy groups and leadership groups in their local communities that are entirely comprised of formerly incarcerated individuals. There was one of the most prominent groups is called Just Leadership USA. They're out of New York City, and they've really done an excellent job of empowering people or helping people to feel empowered and be in leadership roles around decarceration. They do a lot of leadership trainings. We actually hosted their first training outside of New York City 2 or 3 years ago in St. Louis. So they're doing excellent work. I think more and more we're seeing on TV and in media stories, histories, both violent backgrounds, nonviolent backgrounds, being listened to by lawmakers, Obama administration went to prisons themselves and listened to people, but also had people with incarceration histories informing them. And then I personally hire at my research center people with incarceration histories. Between Matt Epperson and I, my co-lead, we have many doctoral students and graduate students that have incarceration histories. So I think the harder question for me to answer would be, how are they not involved? So I appreciate that other people are thinking about that for sure. And our first guiding concept, when it says changing the narrative on incarceration and the incarcerated, that's where we really see the major leadership role in all sorts of places, but that's a really important place for making sure that people have experienced it are highlighted.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope we can get to 2 more questions because I'm really excited about the third one. And this is a good example of how transparency mediates power, because if y'all couldn't see that screen, I would just ask the third question. But can you say quickly how the Ban the Box initiatives do end up being harmful to communities?
The way that, now this is based on 2 studies that happened statewide in New York State and New Jersey State. And what those findings showed was that people, so what the Ban the Box initiative advocates for, and I'm not saying that this initiative shouldn't go forward. I'm saying that we need to pay attention to unintended consequences and see about tweaking things. But what happened there in both states is that when employers were unable to identify on an application or a first meeting or phone call that somebody had been involved with the criminal justice system, what they did instead was just assume, based on the color of the person's skin, the likelihood of them having been involved in the criminal justice system. And they were more likely to not offer jobs or interview opportunities for people with black or brown skin. And that's what the study showed in both states. The studies have also started to pop up in Arizona as well, and they're actually randomized controlled trial studies, which is, I don't know exactly the methodology on how they do that, but they are doing that. So what that says to me is, one, if you're not focusing on those 3 outcomes that I talked about, where racial disparities is a critical one, you might be implementing reforms that have unintended consequences and make racial disparities worse. And that's actually what happened with our determinate sentencing approaches, which takes the discretion away from the judge. So we took discretion away from judges in an effort to promote equity. That removing that discretion from the judges also removed the ability for people to consider contextual and mitigating factors, and that collided in our society with the war on drugs. So what ended up happening is we increased racial disproportionality and racial disparities. So again, the moral of the story is measure the differential impact on on racial disparities, and pay attention to unintended consequences. And you constantly have to relook at policies. I can get to the third one really quickly if you want me to.
Give her timer for 2 minutes, Tyler.
2 minutes. Well, this one's a short one for me.
Okay,
the
great.
private prison system, despite media attention, is really becoming a dying concept. So it was initially used by states and the federal government as cost-saving mechanisms, but what they've discovered that it's not actually saving cost, and that people who go through private prisons don't have better outcomes than people who do not go through private prisons. So there's been a major push at local and federal levels to move away from private prisons. Rather tragically, the private prisons have market. And can anybody guess what that is? Immigration. Right. So the questions to be asking now around private prisons is the use of them to detain children and families around immigration issues, and that's really where they've moved to, particularly at the federal level. At the max peak of private prisons, they house less than 10% of people who were incarcerated. So that's a lot, but that was at their peak level, and it's really it's scaling back.
I will kind of plant that as a seed for our panelists throughout the rest of the day too, thinking about this issue of profit and what's incentivized and what's decentivized in our system. I think it could be an interesting continued conversation. Thank you so much to all of you, and let's give them one more round of applause. Release you from your duties. So we now are going to have two panels of Colorado folks who are going to tell you about some really unique initiatives that are being implemented in their jurisdictions. One of the panels will be before the break. We'll have a short break. One of the panels will be after. If you notice a little exodus, some of our students have other classes that they have to go to. My students were required to be here for the first part, so. So the first panel that we'll invite up is going to focus on narrowing the pathway to prison. And why don't you guys go ahead and join us on stage. So these are folks who are working on the front end of the justice system to think about how we can divert people from incarceration before they get there. And the moderator for this panel is Kim English. She is the research director for the Division of Criminal Justice, where she manages a staff of professional researchers engaged in a variety of criminal and juvenile justice research. So Kim is doing things like policy analysis, program evaluations, population forecasting, actuarial risk scale development and implementation. She's very smart. She's a researcher. She is responsible, really, in her position in the state for thinking with data about how these systems are working. So Kim is going to give us some brief context for her panel, briefly introduce her panelists. Each panelist is going to have some time to introduce their issue, and then Kim will facilitate the further discussion and take questions from the audience. I'll try to identify your missing person. Here's your clicker.
We'll have more time to talk. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm just going to quickly give you some context for what's going on in terms of state-level incarceration here in Colorado. So I've got a pointer. I'm just checking it out here. And a clicker, and we'll see if I can do this without getting confused. This is starting in 1990. So our prison population in 1990 was right here. And if we went back just a few more years, see where my little red dot is there? Right there in 1985, 1986, the General Assembly doubled sentences. Just doubled all felony sentences. Now, why? Because of a heinous crime that happened in the early 80s. All that to say is they doubled sentences, and then they started to try to do some things to slow the pace of growth, but nothing ever really took hold. And so this is 2010-ish. And then admissions to prison slowed because the crime rate was dropping and because we never really know exactly what is going on with the crime rate going up and down. But it was going down here. Now I'm going to show you the next slide, which is going to take a portion of this, starting at, so what I'm going to do is show you from this onward, close up, okay? So this is 2005, and whoops, sorry about that. But what you can see is we're still in that upward trajectory. Now right here, Division of Parole changed their policies around technical violations. You will have heard about that because very many parole officers were angry and called the media. And there was substantial pressure put on the parole department to not do this, to not reduce technical violations. And the truth is, what happens is, with technical violations, people go back to prison for a shorter period of time, But that's not the bulk of what causes the mass incarceration, because those are shorter lengths of stay. So even if you do major reform on technical violations, those folks are going back for 6 months anyway. And so for the most part, that's a short-lived downturn, and that's exactly what we saw. But this is what we were projecting a year ago. I want to show you that we were projecting the population to increase on this low level, this lower line. In the summer, we redid our projections. This was just last July. And then a month ago, these are our new projections going straight up. What's causing this? For one thing, arrests are increasing.
I don't understand.
We have a lot of people moving to Colorado, and the sheer number, the raw number of arrests is going up. But we are especially seeing assault and motor vehicle theft going up, and fraud going up, and theft going up. And so I can't see this slide. I just can't see this very well. I can't see what's in front of me because it's too small and this is just too far away. So all that to say, arrests have been increasing, but the rate per 100,000 is pretty flat. But the raw number is increasing because we have people moving here, a lot of people moving here. And I'll talk about that in a second. Now, criminal court filings have been going, this is a long graph of criminal court filings, but what it's showing is the correspondence between criminal court filings that happen in at District Attorney McCann's office and the 1 year and 2 year admission lag to prison. So prison admissions follow filings. Felony filings have increased about 50% in the last 5 years. Most of that has to do with drug involvement. Not marijuana, but opioids and meth. And that's changing sort of the composition of people's crimes. So they're coming in with drugs and something else more serious. A couple of years ago, the legislature, after several years of debating this and many recommendations to not do this, the legislature did this anyway. They made a felony DUI, which has immediately created a new class of people going to prison. And in the last 2 years, there have been almost 300 people put in prison on just that new crime. Formerly, they were doing time in the county jails, up to 2 years in the county jail. Now they're going to prison. Cases sentenced to DOC are increasing as the Department of Corrections. Most notable was drug possession, which increased by 17% overall and 24% for women. The drug and opioid epidemic is hitting families and women in particular. Drug distribution, motor vehicle theft, and weapons charges, these are all going up. Probation revocation. Probation happens at the front end of the system. It's different from parole. That happens at the back end of the system. Probation is before you go to prison, and hopefully you do your time in the community and you never go to prison. But there are people who get a probation sentence and fail. And in truth, the probation department lets people fail many times. We give people lots of chances. And for a long time, the probation department in Colorado was working very hard to reduce the number of technical violations going to prison. That initiative wasn't sustained, and now they're going back up again. In fiscal year 2017, just last year, almost 40% of new prison commitments were people who failed on probation. Inmates with life sentences are increasing. Prison releases have been declining. In part, that's because length of stay has increased. So people are staying longer in prison and they're not coming out. There are two ways to get out of prison. One is that you basically kill your number and you're a mandatory parole, that's this one. And the other one is you go before the parole board, and you can see that those releases have been going down too. The state population growth is expected to continue, and it's especially growing in the 24 to 44-year age group, which we know is difficult for us, for those of us in the criminal justice system, because those are the crime-prone years. So in summary, arrests are increasing, filings are increasing, we're making crimes that require a prison sentence. Probation revocations, life and indeterminate sentences are stacking up, prison releases are declining, and the state population growth is contributing. This is grim, though. I will tell you that this is a very grim line that just came out of our office, because we do the projections for the legislature and the Department of Corrections every year. So I wanted to provide you with this information because without knowing Dr. Carrie, I purchased her book a couple of months ago. I recommend this to everybody in the room if you want to understand better a new way of thinking about this, because these items are mentioned in the book, which is why I think it's important if you want to really dig, especially the criminal justice professionals who are working in the room, need to understand the forces that are at work and they're happening here in Colorado. So with that, I'll turn it over to my panel. I'm going to, pardon me? Yes, do you want me to introduce one person and then let them talk, or everybody all at once? Let's see. Okay, I'll just do them all at once. Some days it's harder for me to make decisions. Right next to me is my friend Greg Morrow, who has been working in the criminal justice system for many moons and is one of the people I know who uses data all the time and looks at data and can make a story out of data that he's looking at, which is really unusual for folks who don't necessarily have a data background. Greg is director of the Denver Community Corrections Organization, which includes pretrial. He has oversight of the residential community correction system and in-home detention and pretrial services, and his commitment to advancing social justice through data is admirable, and I'm happy to have been able to work with him all these years. I'm doing it one at a time. Is that what I'm doing? Okay.
Whatever you want.
So here's Greg. Yes.
Thank you for that introduction.
That's the clicker. So you need to have your. There we go. That's not. Mike Butler's not with us.
Okay.
There we go.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Kim mentioned, part of my responsibilities in the office are to administer the pretrial program in Denver County. So I'm going to share a little bit on the national scale what's going on in the world of pretrial, but also more importantly what we're able to see happening locally. Is that better?
Yeah.
So I think the first question is, what is pretrial? Sometimes there's a confusion between pretrial program or pretrial system. And so to define the system are these decision points. It really, on the slide here, it talks about it begins at arrest. I would submit to you that it actually begins before that. And we're seeing a lot of work around pre-arrest diversion coming online, and I think that's a certain area that will grow in the future. But it goes from arrest all the way through disposition of the criminal case. So what's the problem that we're seeing in pretrial? Just as you heard from some others, our criminal justice system is complex. It's a maze. It's a complex maze. And once you enter it, it's very difficult to come out of it. Short periods of incarceration have tremendous impacts downstream. Even just a couple of days has significant results both in terms of recidivism and destabilizing family life. The other issue we've had is this proliferation of money bail. And what's occurred with that is high-risk, dangerous defendants are able to be released, while low-risk defendants cannot. And there's one common factor, and that's the ability to pay money to get out of jail. Some emerging research we've seen provided by the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, again, just supports what's been stated before. Even for low and moderate risk, and just 2 to 3 days in jail, you're almost 40% more likely to commit a new crime before trial. If you're held 8 to 14 days, if you're low and moderate risk, you'll have, again, negative consequences downstream. This slide kind of illustrates the populations in our jails, right? You can see that the number of people convicted in our jail is substantially less than those that are just charged or have been arrested. It's been stated nationally that 50 to 60% of jail populations are there pre-trial. What else has increased? The use of cash bail. So I painted a grim picture there. Now let's talk about lightening the room, because there's some good news going on. So what's happening across the country is in all but 3 states in the last few years, you're seeing pretrial reform and pre-arrest diversion reform going on. So there's a lot of movement to take away unnecessary pretrial detention, to change that previous slide. And in Colorado, that's happening as well. We've had 2 or 3 significant improvements over the last few years as a result of the work of the CCJJ. Does everybody know what that is? It's the State Commission on Crime and Juvenile Justice. There was a task force and a committee that created 3 recommendations that became the cornerstone of our new bail statute. And our new bail statutes were repealed and reenacted to do 3 things. Increase the use of risk assessment, which is an evidence-based principle. Reduce the use of money and bail schedules, and increase the use of pretrial service functions to facilitate release. So the CPAT, you heard people talk about risk assessment. The CPAT is the Colorado Pretrial Assessment Tool. It's a 12-item instrument that we use to provide to the court more information, better information using data and science on who should get released pretrial and who might need conditions of release if they are sent into the community. There's the 12 variables. You will see the age at first arrest is on there. And the previous speaker talked about that having some, I guess, some controversy in the system as far as whether or not it produces any racial disparity. The CPAT is undergoing a current validation, and we will test that variable. What it does is it just organizes people into 4 different categories of risk. Low-risk people do really well under supervision. You'll hear that whether it's pretrial or post-conviction. So we should just really minimize any conditions of release they have. We can only harm them by over-supervising. You'll see each of the 4 risk categories have predicted sort of public safety rates, which is defined as new arrests during the pretrial period, or court appearance rates, which means that they attended all their court appearances. Here's what we're seeing in local data. So in 2012, Denver went to the CPAT, and what this graph illustrates is just the 4 risk categories from each of the last 5 years. And the takeaway here is that you truly see how static our population in Denver is assessing in terms of their risk level. It's been stated that if you don't use risk assessment, that individual discretion will overestimate risk 2/3 of the time. Whereas if you use risk assessment, it'll get it right 2/3 of the time. You're not going to see the captions on this slide, but I want to point something out. And I really want to give credit to DA McCann in a second here. So in 2012, Denver had about a 5% unsecured release rate, a PR bond rate. PR is when you are released under your personal recognizance. You don't have to pay any money to get released. That number increased to about 20% through the changes in the bail statute. Beginning here, we worked on a grant, and the district attorney's office assigned prosecutors at the first court appearance, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but it actually increased our PR rate. So you really can't, I mean, I have to applaud DA McCann and Helen Morgan, who is her chief in that courtroom, because we're currently at a 58% PR rate. So from 5 to 58% in just a matter of a few years. As far as outcomes, so again, risk assessment predicts low-risk people do very well under supervision. It's consistent across the years, and it decreases with risk level going up. The one challenge we have is overconditioning. There's a tendency to place a lot of conditions on people pre-trial, and it's a struggle we have. And I think that's one area we need help. We need the researchers to really inform us on what works pre-trial. So.
Thank you, Greg. I just wanted to point out that Denver release rate, the personal recognizance bonds where people are getting out without having to pay money, that has increased significantly, as he pointed out. And I just wanted to add that Greg was saying a 58% release PR bond, personal recognizance bonds. The 4th Judicial District, which is El Paso County, has a 10% PR bond. The first, last year, meaning that only 10% of folks are getting out and everybody else is paying money. They're not using a risk assessment instrument. The 1st Judicial District, which is Jefferson and Teller, bordering Denver, they have a 25% pretrial personal recognizance rate. Boulder, the 20th, has a 38% personal recognizance rate. So what Denver's doing is huge, and it's not happening consistently across the state. We do have a 77% rate in Mesa County, where they've done tons and tons of work to increase PR bonds. But Denver and Mesa County stand out for the work that they've been doing. And I just wanted to give you that comparison to understand how much this matters. So, our next panelist, former District Court Judge Roxanne Balin, was Chief Judge of the 20th Judicial District, which is Boulder, for 15 years. And she has been active and progressive all of those times. We've been lucky to be able to have Judge Balin sit on task forces and subcommittees, and her expertise is just so valuable. Many times judges won't, especially when they're still on the bench, don't feel that they're free to talk about public policy. And so to get that judicial perspective is really, really key. Roxanne currently works as a part-time employee as a consultant for the National Center for State Courts in the areas of leadership and governance. And she also provides motivational interviewing for judges, because every interaction that we have in the criminal justice system with a defendant can make a difference. And so thank you for the work you're doing.
I guess I didn't know as a sitting judge I wasn't supposed to engage in public policy discussions.
Thank goodness.
Seems like absolutely the thing I ought to have been doing, and I did it a lot. I was on the bench for almost 31 years, and so I sort of saw a lot in the changes in incarceration in 94 and 95, when all of the sentences were doubled, and went through the sex offender, which is now not working very well. But early on, I felt like there were all sorts of people who penetrated the criminal justice system far too much. Among them were juveniles, and among them were certain kinds of adults as well. And the major focus of what I want to talk about is the other end from bond reform and diversion.
Boulder has its own co-responder system, like District Attorney McCann was saying. I want to talk more about the people who are high risk and high need and are the ones that we often think about as being obviously on their way to prison. So I'm going to be talking about people at this end of the spectrum. We sometimes talk about those people as having one foot in prison. The technical term we use is prison bound, typically. I want to focus on the people who are high risk and high need, but in my opinion, shouldn't go to prison. This is the decarceration target population, in my view. So the people who are not in this category are people who pose a high risk to our communities but have low needs. Those are the major drug dealers who are not services cost less than the incarceration. So the folks that I think we can make the biggest difference with in terms of decarceration are the high-risk, high-needs people. These are the people that some communities are pretty scared of. I mean, high-risk, high-needs might be somebody who has a raging drug habit and breaks into houses on a regular basis. So burglary is real. It's not just picking up change in an open door. These are the people who steal lots of cars because, they usually it's drugs or alcohol, typically. Repeat assaulters who have significant substance abuse or mental health issues or both. And what I've seen when I have been developing programs during the 15 years that I was chief judge is that some communities would come watch our programs and they would try to replicate them. But what they would do is they would develop a resource-rich program to assist people with low risk and high needs. And as a result, they were throwing tons of criminal justice resources at a problem that was really a community resource problem. In other words, better mental health services, better addiction services, better community supports. And when I would talk to people about doing that, they would say, well, we're trying to get them early. This is a prevention thing. And I would say, but that's not right, because these programs were devised for people who are high risk, high need. That was part of the comment made earlier about if you have a really great evidence-based program and then you implement it in a way that it was never designed to be implemented, in some ways you don't do any good, and sometimes you do real harm. Because if you put low-risk people into high-risk programming, we know from many studies over and over again, they get worse, they don't get better. So, my sort of overarching theme here, which I will now get to, is that there are
things that programs that work have in common when you're dealing with high-risk, high-needs people. And those are that they have to be wraparound services with collaborative groups working to address the needs of the people at the right dose of treatment, the right dose of supervision, and the level of treatment and supervision that is necessary, while holding defendants accountable. A low-risk person, you can send them to some really nice mental health program, an addiction program, they connect with their therapist, and they get better. But people who are high-risk people really need much more than that. They need support, but also accountability. So, couple programs from Boulder. So in 1999, I formed a task force that was a collaboration with our local community mental health center, which in Boulder is called Mental Health Partners, the 20th Judicial District and Probation, the Sheriff's Department, Community Justice Services, which is our pretrial and to some degree post-trial supervision people, public health, and our addiction services. And our mission was to come up with a way of reducing the number of beds used in our county jail by people with severe and persistent mental illness, who almost all of whom also had significant substance abuse issues to an 80% degree, and to provide effective community-based services to reduce recidivism and support public safety, because of course when you're talking about high-risk people, if you ignore public safety, then nobody's going to go for it in your community. So I can give a long description, but I can also give a short description, which is what we came up with was the fact that most people with persistent mental illness were asked to do a whole range of things when they were on probation. They had to go over to mental health, they had to go to addiction services, they had to go to the housing office, they had to go apply for benefits, they had to go someplace else to have their medication administered, job training. And what we did was we co-located all of it. It's an incredibly simple model. So we have what we call a PACE house, and we've had it since 1999, so it's going to be 20 years old next year. What was that about, taking 17 years to?
Right.
So what happens is that the folks that get into this program who have to be high-risk, high-needs, their level of service inventory, which the LSI, which some of you may know something about, has to be at least medium-high risk. So it's consistent with people who go to prison in Colorado, consistent with people who are on parole in Colorado. They have daily trips to the PACE house. They have weekly probation supervision, daily attendance, as I said, mandatory drug and alcohol testing, often daily. They have mandatory psychiatric evaluation. They have administration of medication by a nurse that's on site. If they're on psychotropic medication, which almost all of them are. And specialized employment supports, transportation assistance, connection with other resources. So that's the model. And I didn't ask that this be put on a PowerPoint, but you've all got on your tables a piece of paper that's called PACE Cost-Benefit Analysis. And essentially it shows that jail bed use went down dramatically. We had a actual study done by the University of Colorado, which happily is in our town, and showed that we were, in our first year of operation, reducing jail bed use by 95% under this model. So it's very much a decarceration model. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about is the proliferation of drug courts. We call them treatment courts in Boulder. People call them recovery courts. They've got a lot of different names for them. But it's a National Center Drug Court Institute program. The first one was created in 1989 in Miami. It's been researched to death. You can go online of the National Center for Drug Courts and see hundreds of studies. And we implemented those in Boulder. And again, it's a wraparound support system in which people are staffed on a biweekly basis with everyone who's working with them, so you can't triangulate. You can't tell your therapist one thing and your probation officer something else. And you'll see a piece of paper on one side of which is the study. It's getting a little old now and we have to do another one, but basically after 3 years, the people who graduated, only 23% of them had recidivated, and people who are similarly situated but did not go through the program, 56% of them have recidivated. So it's a huge difference. And on the back of that piece of paper is a slide that looks kind of like the slide that was shown earlier. It's called an ARIMA slide, and it's the one that has a blue, slowly but steadily increasing jail bed use by people who are suffering from substance abuse disorder. The green shows you what jail or prison use is predicted that they would use if there were not an intervention, and the red is the actual jail bed use among our population. So it's a wonderful slide. I recommend it to you, and it shows you that we were able to reduce jail bed use among this population unbelievably dramatically. So those are just 2 programs that our treatment courts now are 12 years old, and the PACE program, as I said, is 19 years old, that if you keep them going, if you sustain them, if you bring the right people into them, if you keep looking at your policies and procedures and keep reading the research and tweaking things so that it's consistent with what the University of Cincinnati, American University, the National Drug Court Institute are telling you, then you can have a very dramatic impact on incarceration. One final thing, because I was asked to talk about the differences among populations. And these 2 models have been found to be as effective among people of color versus people not of color, 25-year-olds versus 55-year-olds. They are incredibly effective and cross that kind of demographic. I would say that it's important to pay attention to cultural competency. So, for example, I'm now teaching the judge in Cortez motivational interviewing, and I sat through one of her staffings, and there are many tribes around there, and she has tribal representatives on her staffing to make sure that she maintains that cultural competency. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Judge Balin. Erin Stifling is a deputy district attorney and the assistant director of the Center for Prevention and Restorative Justice at the 20th Judicial District, which is Boulder. And for the past 12 years, she's been focusing on the development and implementation and evaluation of restorative justice programs. In 2012, Erin was awarded the Victim Advocate of the Year award for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania for this work. And so I think we're really lucky to have her in Colorado. So thank you for being here, and your time is now.
Are we a little behind schedule, Shannon? A little? Okay. So thank you so much for putting this together. I just think this is such a cool event, and I really appreciate all of the different puzzle pieces that you're bringing together for folks to talk about this from different angles. So our piece is at a little bit of a different point than has been talked about before. Can you all hear me okay? Am I in the mic? Into the mic. Okay, I don't have a lot of mic experience. Is this good? Yeah? Okay. So as mentioned, I'm in the DA's office in Boulder County. That's the 20th Judicial District. My background, I'm a non-traditional attorney. My background is mostly restorative justice. Before that, it was social work. And I got involved in restorative justice when I was in law school because I was so impressed with how effective it is, how cost-effective it is. What we know about, and I'm going to start by focusing on juveniles, because that's where a lot of our work began, and then we're expanding out into adults and higher risk populations. But we know this about juvenile development. You guys know all of this as well, that intellectual ability progresses a lot more quickly than impulse control and other decision-making processes, right? I'm going to skip through some of this. We also know that most folks who commit an offense, if we leave them alone entirely, they're going to stop committing offenses on their own without any sort of intervention. So this is a really cool study. Elizabeth Kaufman, are you all familiar with her at all in Irvine? So she's done a really cool study about persistent offenders and about the differences of system contact on juvenile populations specifically and what the impact is. So look her up if that's something you're interested in. But if we leave folks alone, usually they'll stop offending. So we don't want, with our early contact with juveniles who are coming to the DA's office because of law enforcement contact, we want to be really careful about treating them appropriately based on what their level of risk is, based on getting them hooked up with services, not making things worse. And we also don't want to widen the net. We don't want to over-service folks who don't need it. Okay, so that's what we're really looking at trying to do in diversion in the DA's office. We know things that are effective, things that are promising that have been mentioned a lot already are reducing that risk, addressing needs, strengthening protective factors, trying to get in the way of those collateral consequences that have such an impact on increasing criminogenic risk later for folks. And services combined with restorative justice, there are more and more studies now that show that when you combine services with restorative justice, they're incredibly effective. They play off of each other. Things that are ineffective, formal processing, and deepened system involvement. So in the 20th Judicial District, we've had a diversion program for juveniles for a lot of years. In the last several years, partially thanks to Pete Lee's legislation supporting restorative justice, we were able to start a pilot program in Boulder and we had grant funding to do this, to offer pre-adjudication diversion, pre-file diversion, for juveniles. And there were certain exclusions based on the statute, like domestic violence, sex offenses, that sort of thing. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. But what we found, and he mentioned the statistics, is with that population, the recidivism was only 9%. And that's for all of the pilot programs statewide. There were 4 different sites that were chosen. Through that work, we were able to really refocus and redesign our program. We were able to look at a lot of research. We were able to start working with implementation science to figure out what are we trying to do? What are our goals? What are we using to get to our goals? Are those things working? And it was really hard work and it was messy and we didn't know what the heck we were doing for quite a while. And then all of a sudden things kind of started to fit into place. I don't know if anybody's done implementation science work before, but I've heard that that's pretty typical. And we came up with a model. I'm going to jump to our model real quick of diversion. This is for supervised diversion. We have several different tracks of diversion depending on what the person's level of risk is, depending on what their needs are, because again, we don't want to over-service. But basically, we're combining diversion supervision with repair of harm, with restorative justice. Does everybody know what restorative justice is? You guys know all about restorative justice. Yes, that's awesome. That was not the case 10 years ago when I got involved in restorative justice, so that makes me really happy. Now we have expanded to adult diversion. We're doing similar things. We're expanding our different models, our different tracks, to try to be more responsive to the specific clients and charges that we have, and we're handling about 450 cases annually. 92% successful completion for juvenile diversion, 95% for adult diversion. It's actually 35% because there were a lot more filings on the juvenile diversion side. We diverted about 1/3 of all juvenile district court cases last year. That last quarter of the year, for some reason, there was a huge uptick, and so that our diversion number is a little bit lower. But we're diverting everything from petty offenses, misdemeanors, all the way up to felonies. There are a lot of different places that restorative justice happens, and I created this slide to try to help and pinpoint where we are. Restorative justice can happen at the school-based level. It can happen at a community-based level. Law enforcement can direct refer to restorative justice. That's what happens Boulder County Sheriff's Office. That's what happens with the Longmont Police. A lot of direct referrals to community-based restorative justice. And then after the police have contacted the youth and written a summons, written a referral to juvenile court, the case comes to us. It comes to the prosecutor's office. And we have a lot of discretion at that point to decide what's going to happen. Are charges going to be filed? What charges are going to be filed? Is the case going to be diverted? Is it eligible for diversion? We have a lot of power of choice at that point. And we want to be really fair and equitable about how we exercise those choices. And so within our unit especially, we're really looking at tracking data now. For the first time, about 3 or 4 years ago, we started really tracking data and looking at what's going on with our program. But we provide the diversion point after law enforcement contact. We're doing restorative justice processes. We're having restorative conversations with the youth. And that's all happening prior to adjudication. And then after adjudication, probation often takes over. They have restorative justice. There's restorative justice options that happen with DYC. Pete was reading some quotes from a process that had happened through the Department of Corrections. So it's an option at lots of different points in the process, which I think also shows that we're making a lot of progress. But ultimately, our goals are accountability and repair of harm, restoration. Our program is really victim-centered. That's something that's super important to me personally, because as mentioned earlier, I think victims often get left out of the equation. And I think what's so cool about restorative justice is that we can do all of this at once. Like, we can support victims, and we can support offenders, and we can reduce risk, and we can increase accountability. We can do all of this at once. And so far, we're having great outcomes. Supervised diversion, we typically do the assessment. We do a risk assessment to determine what level of risk there is for the youth to commit another crime. We get them hooked up with community-based services that are going to try to drive down those risk factors. So if that's counseling, if that's substance use, monitoring, whatever it is, we try to get them hooked up with a service that is in their community so that it's something that can continue beyond our involvement in their lives, which we want our involvement to be as minimal as possible. We want to stay out of the way of the positive stuff. We want to get in and out of lives as quickly as we can. And then there's that element of accountability and repair that has to happen. For unsupervised diversion, this is a new program that we've started recently in county court, just in the last several months. And this is for MIPs, mostly low-level shoplifting. Oh, sorry, minor in possession?
Of alcohol.
Of alcohol, but it's also possession of marijuana and paraphernalia. We're doing all of those. And these cases, the substance use cases, we're diverting straight to public health. Our public health program in Boulder County provides some different tiers of intervention and assessments and screening. And that way, we're not trying to be experts in something we're not experts in. We're not trying to assess and determine what is this person's need for substance use counseling or what interventions are going to be effective. We're giving that to the people who know how to do that. That, so far, is going really, really well. Restorative justice goals are the same as district attorney goals: accountability, victim satisfaction, community safety. And so we've really embraced that. There's a lot of misconceptions, maybe not in this crowd, about what restorative justice is, but if I'm presenting to law enforcement or something like that, you know, there's this idea that you're supposed to be playing guitar and hugging and whatever else at a restorative justice process. It's not about forgiveness. That's not the goal. It's not about getting along. It's not assigning community service. It's about people coming together to talk about what happened, who was affected, and what needs to happen to repair the harm. And we put victims really central. So if their need is forgiveness, then that could be what it's about. If their need is for an apology, that could be what it's about. But it's a really structured process that works. We have well-trained facilitators that go through a 24-hour training, which on your tables, there should be little handouts for how you can get involved as a volunteer. We also have a community member training coming up. Do you guys know what's going on in this slide? Anybody recognize this? No? Yeah. So this is a man who kidnapped these 3 women and held them hostage. And they're reading their victim impact statement to the court. And I just think this is such a powerful image, because is he listening? Is he looking? Are the attorneys listening? Are they looking? And I've been talking really quickly, and I know I'm out of time because we were pushed for time, but in restorative justice, restorative justice is not about letting somebody off the hook. It's not about going easy on crime. It's about accountability. And in a restorative justice process, you have to sit face to face with the person you harmed. And that's so much more powerful and helpful for victims who want to participate. These are some of our outcomes I want to touch on super quick. Our processes are showing increased accountability, increased understanding by the youth who, and this actually includes juveniles and adults in our program, increased understanding of harms and impacts on the victim, on their community, on their family. Diversion's helping them make positive changes in their lives. It's helping them take responsibility. We have 100% victim satisfaction. So earlier folks talked about dissatisfaction with the traditional justice process. We have 100% victim satisfaction and 95% diversion participant satisfaction. So that's pretty impressive. We're really proud of that. There's a ton of research out there now showing the efficacy of restorative justice for recidivism, restitution collection. We have 100% restitution collection for our pre-file diversion juveniles. And again, we're increasing the number of cases that are diverted. It's a little less than that. I apologize for that incorrect number. And our recidivism has gone way down. The 8% is for our program. That 9% number was for all of the pilot programs. We're at 8%. And that's concurrent with us implementing this program. In the same time, in the county, filings are going down. The detention of low-risk youth is going down. And the number of probation clients is going down. And this is, again, all concurrent with what we're doing with diversion. And so obviously it's a correlation. I can't say that we're doing all of this, but it's all part of the puzzle. So we are seeing really positive impact. This is all, you all have talked about all of this, but I just want to point out that Boulder County DA's office is also working on a lot of other issues like opioid, I can never say opioid, task force, and trying to create a lot of other pathways for diversion as well in other areas that we know are issues. But please get in touch with us, come volunteer. We could use your help. Sorry that was so quick.
We are we're minutes behind schedule, but I do want to give a chance if you have questions of our presenters that you don't want to hold on to until the break or the end or the networking reception, but something that would really bring light right now. And maybe you have some. Yeah, so if we could try to do like 10 minutes and then we'll shorten our break just a scooch and then go over just a scooch. Would that be okay? Okay, thanks.
So I'll scooch over here, and I'm going to ask Greg, given that more people are going out on pretrial supervision without money bond and being released on their own personal recognizance, meaning that more people are getting released and not staying in jail pretrial, are you concerned about the recidivism events or the new crime events that happen when you have a larger pool of people in the community awaiting trial?
So I'd first say that, of course, we're always concerned about recidivism. But if you might remember the last slide I showed, that you see that pretrial supervision is extremely successful, and there is a correlation between risk. So if you look at releasing more and more low to moderate risk defendants, even with very limited supervision, Representative Lee talked about just court reminder calls. That's one of the most researched interventions we have in pretrial that is effective at reducing failure to appears. As far as what we call our public safety rate, you can see that it's less than 10% of the time people are rearrested during that pretrial phase.
Do you have any any information about the cost benefit of doing this kind of work? Didn't you do a cost benefit analysis?
Yeah, Denver was a demonstration site along with the state of Delaware and Yakima County and Washington State. And this was a sponsored initiative through the Department of Justice. And part of that initiative was to create a cost benefit analysis. I don't have the exact numbers here, but what it approximately showed is that through Denver's initiative to facilitate pretrial release and reduce unnecessary pretrial detention, even factoring in costs of new crimes and cost of FTAs, Denver saved several $1 million over the last few years in cost avoidance of jail beds and management of an inmate population.
Often one of the things that you'll hear from folks in the community is that this push to not have bail, money bail, and the push to try to move people out of jail pre-trial is affecting our crime rates. But when you look closely at the data, there's nothing that really suggests that that's the case. So thank you for that.
The other piece of that is that the people who do commit crimes while they're on bond, mostly they're at a much lower level of seriousness than what they were in for to start with. And the other piece of it is that they get to go back to work and they can pay their child support and they can, pay for food. And if we incarcerate people pre-trial and then they're convicted and we put them on probation, the first thing we say to them is go get a job. And if I were one of them, I would say, I had a really good job and you made me lose it. So we were doing things that were very counterproductive and contraindicated.
That's right. And to that end, when you, Judge Balin, talk about wraparound services, and the co-location of services, that's a recommendation in many domains, the co-location of services. And I think that that's just something I want the social workers in the room to hear. If you can set up shop near where people need their services to be. Can you say something about the problem with transportation among the defendant population?
So certain populations do much better if it's co-located, and that was definitely true about people with serious mental illness and addiction. And lots of defendants don't have daytimers, and they're not necessarily coping with all of the appointments all that well. And then some people do fine with the collaboration of the people who are providing the services, but they don't necessarily have to be going to the same place all of the time. But they're more high functioning, probably have less mental illness on board. Transportation is a huge problem. A lot of people that we deal with have lost their driver's licenses, which is, of course, another sort of counterproductive thing we do in our system. Or their financial situation is such that, having to pay $2.60 every time they get on a bus is too hard for them. So one of the things that we did in working with, let's say, domestic violence victims who maybe are living in the shelter, but they have no way to get someplace. We look at different kinds of grants that have transportation pieces to them. In our probation department and also in our PACE program, we hired people who were called case aides, and there's certain prohibitions about putting people in your cars if you're a certain kind of employee, but no prohibitions if you're a different kind of employee. So if you look at all of that whole landscape, you can figure out where you can plug in the various ways that you can get people places.
One of the things I just want to, you guys had great data, and one of the things that I would encourage you to do is break down that data by race and ethnicity, because I'd like to see the program outcomes and bail and bond decisions, because I know when we did the major bond reform here in 2013, prior to that, if you were looking at the personal recognizance rates, statewide, 15% of white people were released on a personal recognizance bond before we did major bond overhaul, and 9% of black people were. Afterwards, in the 3 years afterwards, we increased our personal recognizance bond from 15% for white people to 26% for white people. And we increased it for blacks from 9% to 21%. So we still see the discrepancy that the benefits are not always equally distributed across the race and ethnicity. And so I would, I see one of our questions up here. Aaron, I actually had a question for you. I looked at Boulder data in preparation for this, and it was actually obvious to me that something was going on because you had so few cases in juvenile court. So that line that you had going down, what you're doing, I would encourage you, without being able to ask the question because we're time crunched, to consider your exclusionary criteria. Because I think that some of the ways that we identify our target populations for certain programs exclude people who have crimes that are more scary to us sometimes, and they disproportionately affect black and brown people. So I would just throw that out there. But one of the questions up here is, Aaron, you mentioned an opioid task force. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that task force is working on?
Yeah, briefly. A lot of folks in the county, different agencies and providers in the county, is this one on? Yeah, okay. Are coming together to really try to tackle what's going on with opioids and the incarceration of folks with opioid addiction. And so we're looking at a lot of different possible intercepts for where to try to catch people and get them off that trajectory. And so that could start with the co-responder sort of model with police. That can be, at the point of arrest. That can be after arrest at the bond hearing. I mean, there are a lot of different. They're looking at every possible place that we could try to divert someone into services and get them connected with services. One of the things that we're really struggling with is systems. I mean, and gaps in systems, and being able to collaborate with lots of different providers and different services that are doing their own thing. And I think we do that really well in Boulder County, better than a lot of places that I've seen, and there's still a lot of challenges. There are things in the judicial system, for example, we offer pre-filed diversion for juveniles and adults, so we haven't filed the charges in court. A lot of times there are services that we can only access if we file charges. For example, if a juvenile needs a guardian ad litem, we can't get a court order for a guardian ad litem until we file charges. So that's an example of a system barrier that we're really struggling with and figuring out how to address. There's also a huge gap in supports and services for lower level mental health and substance use needs that we see in Boulder County specifically. So, but the opioid task force is making a lot of progress and moving forward, and I'm expecting there to be some more concrete plans that are rolled out in the next 6 months or so.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna cut us short. I wish that we had more time for questions, but we'll have a 10-minute break. Let's convene here at 3:40. And I'm really excited about our last panel, which will focus on reentry challenges. If I could touch base with those panelists, and you can go ahead and get comfy up here real quick. See you all back in 10 minutes, and restrooms are through. Some snacks are appearing. Thank you so much.
Voilà, ils sont corus, on se regarde et on passe en là.
didn't get to. And I did want to say that certainly the elected officials in the various districts does impact the policies that are implemented in those districts, and that may come up during this panel also, but I also want to say that we're seeing the use of restorative justice and diversion increasing, I think, across districts and in districts with DAs of both parties. So as Carrie mentioned at the beginning, there is a lot of promise in terms of a bipartisan approach. So I'm really excited about our last panel. I promise at the end of this panel there are snacks and wines and beers, so just hang in there.
Yeah, we'll stay here. It's cheaper. I don't have any cash, so that works out well.
Our second panel is really focused on the post end of the criminal justice system. So we talked about a lot of diversion and a lot about what to do when people are coming in, but now we want to spend some time thinking about how we close that revolving door, how we keep people from coming back, and how we also engage in prevention activities. So our moderator for this panel, and he is a licensed clinical social worker. Yay! Okay. Yeah, social workers clap like this. We're so delicate. Kevin is a You'll wind him up, I know.
I know I will.
Kevin is the social work coordinator for the Office of the Alternate Defense Counsel, and he supports 20 independent contract social workers who are working on criminal defense teams. He's also been a mitigation specialist for several high-profile and complex crimes. The ADC has an internship for our social work people. And Kevin has really been taken a lead role in navigating this role of social work and in criminal defense work. So we're really happy to have him here. He's going to give a short introduction of the panelists, and then they're going to give a brief intro, and then we'll have some time for further discussion.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for having somebody from the defense here.
Yeah.
I really do appreciate it. We're not recognized that often at these, so it's really important for us to be here. This is Christy Donner. She is the founder and the executive director of the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition. And she co-authored Parenting from Prison, a book that I used with several of my clients and it's really helpful. She's the project lead. Was the project lead for Getting On After Getting Out, a book about reentry services and reentry in Colorado. And she's the Colorado representative on the executive committee for the National Network for Justice. If you are at all involved in this work, Christy Donner has touched your work or your life in some way, shape, or fashion.
Positively, you wanted to put positively.
I hope. Yeah.
You never know with me.
Are we doing individually or? Okay. Next in line is Richard Paul Morales. He's the Deputy Director of the Latino Coalition for Community Leadership, or the LCCL. He leverages state and federal funds to assist and build capacity in local community organizations to serve high poverty, high crime communities of color, and his focus is on reentry. We've met Dr. Brandon Matthews here. We'd like to welcome him back to talk. He's part of the Alliance for Criminal Justice Innovation, a group that works to do consultation with other organizations about how they can work better and smarter. And Lauren Jablonski, I apologize.
You got it.
Yeah. Is a graduate of Metro State University. She has her bachelor's in criminology. She's a probation officer and a national trainer on a model that she came up with for working with women on probation with high-risk needs. And yeah, that's it.
That's it. Thank you.
So Christy, if you would, please tell everybody about what you do and.
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, I'm Christy Donner, and I will tell you a little bit about CCJRC if you haven't heard about it. So we were founded in 1999 just as regular people who were really concerned about the pretty much unprecedented growth in the prison population and concerns about what was driving it, the racial disparity, how were kids being impacted. We all hate the drug war, right? And so we really thought we needed to do something different. There is nothing special about us, except most of us are directly impacted by either crime or the criminal justice system. And so we kind of speak from that place of knowing. And so we've been doing a lot of policy work over the last 20 years. We're just going into our 20th legislative session. And, we've evolved in our thinking about it because we really were the no more prisons people and we were the we hate private prisons people, right? Which we still do, right? But we also realized that that wasn't actually going to be enough because we work and live in communities that are highly impacted by crime and criminal justice involvement, and nothing was better. So we're spending almost $1 billion a year now on incarcerating, and I'm just talking about the cage part of this budget. I'm not talking about law enforcement or prosecutors or judges or courtrooms. And we said there is nothing better. I live in Northeast Park Hill, had a shooting right in the back of in my alley the other night. There is nothing better in my community. There's nothing better in Montbello. There's nothing better. And we could go on and on and on and on. So we thought, okay, what does it look like to do better? Where we can actually say to the community, we're actually advancing health and safety. Not talking about it or not trying to do, but we can actually measurably say there are communities that are safer and better. There are fewer people that are victims. There are fewer people that are getting caught up in the system. More people's needs are being, we have tighter communities, you know, yada, 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 right? So we actually went through a pretty intensive reevaluation of our mission a couple of years ago. And so now we are really looking at how are we overusing the entire criminal justice system, right? Not just incarceration. But really the second half of that question is how do we advance community health and safety? And so that has been we're still the no more prisons, we hate private prisons people, but we've really branched out more to be looking at how do you do community-based interventions and strategies, and how do you have resources that flow? Because I've been in the nonprofit world my whole life, right, and I get that, that comes with certain, you know, burrito sales and private foundation grant writing, I get that, right? I'm an ED, I get that. But what is no longer an acceptable model is that we resource systems and we defund communities. So I'll talk, if it comes up, about a couple of things that we've done to help, and we've done in collaboration with others, to kind of transition how we think about how we resource what strategies, not just into systems, but into communities. And we did that. And if you don't adore this human being, at the end of this, there's something wrong with you. Because the Latino Coalition has pioneered something that is so innovative and so amazing. It caught my attention from afar, and what they're doing in Colorado right now is revolutionary in terms of reentry and helping people get back into the community. But I want to set a context for this, and then I'm going to shut up. Although I do have coffee in front of me, which means I could blather on for quite a while. But this is not just a hypothetical conversation when we talk about how do we reduce the number of people that are either in or cycling in the criminal justice system. Because I just left the Capitol. I've been there a lot over the last couple of weeks. The prisons are full. DOC is requesting $37 million in new prison expansion, and the legislature is looking for solutions. So this is happening right now in real time. This isn't just a hypothetical conversation, right? So I just wanted to offer that, and then I'll stop, and then we can go down. But how we think about, we're policy people, we're not direct service people, but like I said, 1,000 of our members are currently in prison. We have people that walk in our door at the Denver Inner City Parish every day that are looking for some kind of hope and support, and we try and do a lot of resource and referral and things like that. We help people try to connect, because there's such a gap between when you're in the system and how do you connect to the help that you need. And so we try to sit in that bridge space as much as we can. But we look at this from a policy perspective. So one of the ways that we think about reentry was an awareness that we actually don't fund any community-based reentry, right? Or we didn't. So in 2014, we worked on legislation, it's House Bill 1355, that for the first time created a grant program within the Department of Corrections that is now funding 8 organizations? 7.
9 cities.
Oh, 7, that's right, 7, so I just averaged to 8. 7 organizations in 9 cities that are actually providing one-on-one support to people who, and the thing that's amazing about this is that the folks that are leading this are all, like 60% of the case managers are ex-cons themselves. They are transforming how we do reentry. These organizations are in the communities where people are returning to. They're connected to the communities that they're returning to. They've been down this path, and they're having incredible outcomes. So from a policy perspective, that's how we approach reentry, is from a structural position, right? Not a direct service position.
Okay.
Yep. And we got a sunset review that happened a couple of weeks ago, because it was a 3-year grant program, and it was reauthorized for another 5 years, unanimously voted out of the House Judiciary Committee. All committee members wanted to co-sponsor the reauthorization. So, and it's being profiled as a national model in a report that just came out from the Urban Institute last week. So that's this guy.
Great. Thank you so much.
Is that too much?
No, it's perfect. Perfect.
I didn't say fuck.
That's all right. Richard, let everybody know about what you do.
Thank you. My name is Richard Morales, and I'm with the Latino Coalition for Community Leadership, and we've been around since about 2004. And really, what we were seeing is that the communities most impacted by crime and the consequences of mass incarceration are often treated as insignificant or peripheral to these very issues. So it was something that happened to the community, but they were never allowed to come in and take part in actually providing some of the solutions in any real meaningful way regarding funding or being part of the system. But oftentimes at the same time that these very communities had adversarial relationships with the criminal justice system and local law enforcement just because of the different interactions that these communities of colors were seeing. So very understandable, but not very productive in terms of how do we move that conversation along. And then we also saw that a lot of these community and faith-based organizations rarely had the infrastructure or the funding to do the work that they were doing. They were making things work by working out of their cars, their garages, their homes. They were doing these things at night, on weekends, foregoing other paying jobs to do these things in the community where they were just really led to provide and work on behalf of their fellow citizens. And at the same time, we were seeing these organizations that had such tremendous potential because they had things in the community that couldn't be replicated by a system. These individuals were part of that community. They lived, shopped, worshiped, played, raised families, recreated, all in the same community that the people that they were serving. So when you do that, you get to know the people around you. You get to know who's auntie of Joe who's getting in trouble, or the grandmother, or whoever that is. And there's a certain power to that, and really be able to go and talk to people. And remember, this is talking to people. This is what's happening, not systems talking to people, it's people talking to people. So that's a strength of that. And a lot of times these individuals were really good at that because they had the same type of life experience. And I'm not talking about ethnicity, I'm talking about life experience. They've gone through the same type of issues, walked those same streets, faced those same types of barriers that these other individuals were going through, so they had a lot to offer. They also had a lot of street credibility. They had a lot of trust. These weren't people parachuting into the communities trying to provide these services or do good, which that's all well intended and helpful, but this missing piece really does matter. And those strengths, when we look at that and we combine that with some real programmatic strengths of really wrapping around these organizations and being able to develop them as an entity within their own community, that's where we really saw the magic happen. Because really providing that infrastructure on the inside and really upskilling a lot of the staff and the individuals that were working really made a difference, because now you're combining this competency and this passion together. And that's really a powerful combination. And so for our part, we've really been working hard to advocate at first on the federal level. The feds were the first one to kind of get what is this intermediary? Because what we're able to do is provide that infrastructure. So that programming, all the case management, policies and procedures, financial systems, all of those kinds of things that would really be difficult for these smaller organizations to replicate, to be able to just plug into ours. And as long as they follow that process, they're in compliance with all these rules and regulations that nobody ever wants to know about. And really what happens with that is instead of spending time on this administrative stuff, they spent more time focusing on people. And that's why they were in that job. That's what they were there to do. So during that time, we've gotten about $34 million from federal and state sources and pumping those into these marginalized communities. And that's been a powerful piece of, we really had to have some meaningful dollars around this. You can't do the burrito sales that we've traditionally done, and we can't do this on $10,000 here, $5,000 there. We have to have some substantive dollars behind this so they can have a modicum of stability and staff and infrastructure to really do the job. And then from there, we've seen that they've consistently leveraged so many different services within the community. So when you look at one organization that we're funding, it's like this hub and a wheel where they have 20 other entities that they're working and collaborating with. And sometimes our bigger problem is to get them to spend the entire budget because they're getting so many leveraged in-kind contributions that are coming in that just weren't expected. So there's a lot of things that are happening there. And a lot of times that happens is that technical assistance of getting them to understand the practicals, whys, and the hows, and what needs to be done, and checking the boxes and all of those things. And while everybody's always said the money is good, what they said what really made the difference was the capacity building. That ability, that really deep investment into themselves as their staff and the organizations to really make them a viable entity that you could engage with, that systems could understand and see the accountability, the reports, the data, the information, the fiscal accounting, all of those things that made sense to the system. And that's what's really helped them actually become part of the conversation. So now they're at the table, where before they were never thought of. Now they're coming and they're part of these communities and these panels and these committees with a voice that's really coming from that perspective. And a lot of things that we're seeing is, and I was really glad one of the questions that they had asked is, what steps are being taken to be adequately responsive to race and class disparities. And that's what this whole program is about. It's really putting those money in those communities. And as Christy pointed out, it's about 60% of all the staff, and that's from the organization's executive director all the way down to the case manager. This isn't just frontline staff that we're talking about, it's everybody that actually have had this life experience. And they're not minor things. 3 of the staff collectively spent over 72 years in prison. These are really long times in prison, and they've got a lot to offer. And I think that's one of the things that I'm most proud of in seeing this transformation happen, is where they were often seen as a liability in these programs. They're now seen as a crucial piece of making this all work. And that's something I really credit to the policy side of being forward-thinking and saying they have to be part of the solution, and also the Department of Corrections really showing the leadership of making that happen. Because they're going through background checks. We're seeing this information. They're talking about it. They're authorizing individuals. We haven't had one that's been turned down yet. And they're also letting these individuals inside the prisons. So people that they had been with for decades, they're going back and they're seeing the individuals who are there and what they're doing with their lives, and that's such a powerful, powerful model. So one of the things that I'd really encourage you all in the work that you do is really understand who are the indigenous community leaders in the communities that you're working in. Not the referral resources, not where's the referral, how do I send this to somebody? That's mechanics. You really have to get in, have coffee, meet with them, go to their sites, take your computer, do some work, see what's going on. That's gonna do you far more justice in terms of you being able to really leverage what they're doing, and also for them to get to trust you. Because sometimes engaging with some of your systems, there's so many processes and procedures just to get to the yes, or yeah, I think we can help you, that they throw up their hands and say, forget it. Where a lot of times if you're there understanding and listening and conversating with them, they have a better understanding of your process and how to actually go through that. So those are some things that I would encourage you, and I just really applaud all the work that you guys are doing, because it's such an incredible piece of the puzzle. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to ask you a couple of questions, actually. Brandon.
Hi, I'm back. Brandon Matthews. I'm here representing the Alliance for Criminal Justice Innovation, and we are doing work specifically right now I'll talk about in the community space. I wanted to mention that with decarceration initiatives like Christy was talking about, policy changes that ultimately impact the way the community gets involved. So you change a policy at the sentencing level, you pour money into community-based organizations. Then now you have a population who is going to those community organizations for case management, for services, for connection. And those community-based organizations, or community and faith-based organizations, I will call them CFBOs from here on out, they then need some infrastructure and support in order to be successful. And what Richard talked about, and it's great what they do, they're an intermediary, they're able to provide that capacity, that structure, but the next level below that is, what does the practice look like for the individuals who are actually managing the cases? And so that's where our focus lies, is to really help the individuals who are engaging in the practice understand that there's a couple of things they've already got going for them that justice-based agencies don't. We like to lovingly refer to it as the special sauce. So there's a special sauce that happens with folks who are in community-based organizations that does not exist, or exists only slightly in justice-based organizations because of the power dynamic that is inherent to the system. You go into one of the programs that are here, Servicios de la Raza or the Inside Out, that power dynamic is non-existent. They simply have a relationship. We refer to it as a supportive alliance. That doesn't have to be drilled into the practitioner because it just is there inherently. It is part of who they are because they've experienced the thing that their client population has experienced. So that supportive alliance, that special sauce, is so critical to what happens in these community organizations. But unfortunately, that's not enough. And there was, back in 2013 or 2014, a project where Second Chance Act grant money was given to a bunch of community organizations in order to engage in this type of work. And in 2016 or 2017, the final evaluation came out, and it was concerning. 7 organizations were part of that evaluation, and what they determined was, out of all 7 of those organizations, none of them had better outcomes than those who didn't get specialized money and specialized dollars to provide more services. And we asked ourselves, well, why? Why did these community organizations who have special sauce already going for them not have better outcomes than some of the other agencies who were doing the same work and didn't get extra funding and extra resources? And we came to the conclusion that the answer is the disparate activities they had going on weren't targeted enough to get a good outcome. So although the special sauce existed, it wasn't concentrated enough inside of a practice model to deliver an outcome that we would expect from someone who is getting more money. And that's where we're focusing today, is really helping the practitioners understand that your special sauce, that's already one box we do not have to check. That is something we do not even have to address, unlike the folks that we work with who are in the justice system. That's where we start. But there's all of this other stuff that's going on in your practice that we need to anchor to what we know empirically works to get a good outcome, what empirically works to change human behavior, to motivate people to want to do differently, to want to engage in the services that you're trying to connect them with. And so we, as ACGI, have developed a practice model. It's called Innovate for Impact. It's integrative in that we have no desire to impose upon any of these organizations who we believe are already in a great spot. We have no desire to impose upon them a model that they have to use. What we are trying to do is use the practices that they are already engaging in, the resource brokerage, the special sauce relationship, the talks that they're doing, and anchor them in the science. Their relationship has tons of research behind it, the Supportive Alliance. The way they engage with folks in their communication, it's motivational interviewing if you listen to it and you sit through it, but they didn't know that that's what it was. The principles of effective intervention that have all the things that justice practitioners know apply to what they do too. It just looks different when you're sitting there in front of it. So we've developed a model that helps them understand the things they are doing are rooted in research. And if you do them in a concentrated manner, those outcomes that we got out of those 7 community-based organizations are going to be better. They're going to be awesome. Probably better than the justice systems who are engaging in the same practices because of the dynamic that exists in community organizations that does not exist in justice-based organizations. So Innovate for Impact is kind of our approach at helping community-based or community and faith-based organizations get to the point where they can engage in case management practice that is rooted in research, even though they're not part of the justice system. They're doing it better, and we like to think maybe becoming a competitor to the justice system in that there's just something you can get there that you can't get in a probation agency or a parole department or a community correctional facility. There are roles for all of those in our system, but there's also a role for the CFBOs in our system, especially if they are targeting that special sauce and rooting it to the empirical research.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
Can I have it?
Yeah.
I didn't bring notes, so I need that.
Brandon just he was
cruised right through.
Yeah.
Who needs those? Yeah. I need a little bit more guidance. Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Lauren Jablonski. I'm a probation officer in Boulder. I work with female-specific caseload, and my women are all categorized as what Judge Balin earlier described. So they are high risk and high needs. So very high risk to recidivate, very high needs level. They are often homeless, jobless. They are separated from their children or have 0 to very seriously unhealthy relationships with their and they are chronically criminally involved. So I'm going to skip my bio. So we know that gender makes a difference. Research tells us that women come into the criminal justice system for very different reasons than men. We know that they're very relational, so relationships in their life have a huge impact on their ability to keep coming back into the system. We know that they are typically high needs, so they don't have housing, they don't have jobs, they weren't given adequate life skills to manage life stressors. We also know that there's a high prevalence of substance use with women who come into the criminal justice system. So we see a lot of substance use and dependency issues that need to be addressed. There's a lot of violence and trauma which they've survived in their lifetime. So that aspect of their life needs to be addressed as well to keep them from coming back. And so Boulder, about 10 years ago, saw that about 30 to 40% of women were being successful on probation. That's a huge problem. That is not a good number. So the issues that they were seeing were that some women were doing okay. They had a really good relationship with their probation officer, which was key. We know that's about 30% of what matters, right, is that relationship. Gender-specific services, trauma-specific services, and having a legal system that understood their specific needs is what they were needing in order to change that number. So the barriers that we saw were that they had issues with transportation. They couldn't get to their probation appointments or bring their kids to their therapy appointments, so they would miss those appointments. They had criminal involvement all over the place because, you know, girlfriend in Adams County, boyfriend in Douglas County, and they're picking up cases everywhere in between, right? So we're like, how do we even put all of this together? Navigating the criminal justice and human services system. Oftentimes we would have an open dependency and neglect case where they're managing that case manager, those requirements, as well as their criminal case requirements and terms and conditions. So does anybody know who this person is? Oh, good. Okay. So that's Dr. Stephanie Covington, and she developed 6 guiding principles to effectively supervising women in the community. And these are what those principles are. So gender, acknowledging that gender does make a difference. We just talked about what that means and why gender makes a difference with women and men too, but we're going to talk about the ladies today. Environment, creating a safe environment because the people that we're dealing with have been traumatized. They've survived a lot. And so even just creating a safe relationship and space for them is going to make a huge impact in how you're able to work with them around their behaviors. Relationships, pay attention to them. Who are they hanging out with? What was their relationship with their parents like? Who are their supports? What about their children? And then pointing them to appropriate services and having them supervised appropriately. We use the LSI, the level of supervision inventory, to determine the risk level of clients, to determine how often we see them and how to service them appropriately, where their risk is. And women will disproportionately score higher on this because they're so high needs. So we want to take that into consideration as well. Socioeconomic status, the girls that we get that are high risk and high need are of lower socioeconomic status disproportionately. So connecting them with resources for food, housing, clothing, job services, transportation, all of that makes a difference in their ability to be successful. And then re-engaging them in their community and giving them new ways to engage in their community. They're not just a bad mom. They're not just a drug addict. They're not just, the sister who we don't talk to anymore. They're not the girl who was in the paper. We have to give them a new connection to their community. Okay, so these are pictures that I swear I have releases for. So these are all ladies that I work with. Before I get into the specifics of our programming, I want to let you guys know that between 2011 and 2015, we did some statistical data on the amount of women who are successful in our programming. So statewide, FOP, which is the Female Offender Program, which I hate that name. It is like the worst, so we just renamed it and we're doing all the paperwork. It's the Female Opportunity Program. And the Adult Integrated Treatment Court, all these ladies, we had an 86% success rate during that time period, which is huge. Statewide is around 50, between 50 and 60, depending on where you are, and sometimes even lower. So we have intensive programming where they are required to complete life skills classes, which include substance abuse skills, cognitive behavioral skills, relapse prevention skills, and general life skills. We have a cooking class where we have a chef come in. The women, do you guys all know Cooking Matters? If you do, it's totally free. They'll come in, they bring a chef, they do nutrition lessons, they bring food, the women learn how to prep, cook a meal, and then they get to bring home the ingredients to make that meal for their family for up to 4. It's really incredible. Creates a nice bond. And then these ladies, they'll often come in and say, I hate women. I hate other women. After this class, they are laughing together. They have new pro-social connections. They have people to go to NA meetings with. It's pretty incredible. So we have that class. We do Healing Trauma, which is a curriculum by Stephanie Covington. You do not have to have letters behind your name to facilitate that curriculum. So it's a 6-week class where they learn skills to manage their trauma symptoms. And then they are also required to complete a restorative justice victim empathy course, which is a 1 full-day course where we look at the impact of their crimes, and we tailor that to whomever's in the class. So if it's overwhelming, substance possession, or if it's theft, that's what we tailor the course to. So we create those opportunities for connections with other women, and when they graduate these programs, this is often the first time they finish something in their life. So we try to celebrate everything as often as possible. If they took 3 out of the 6 classes, they get a certificate that says you attended 3 out of 6 classes of healing trauma. We don't say you don't get to graduate because you missed those classes because maybe you had child care issues, maybe you relapsed. I don't care, but you completed those 3. So this last quarter, we had a 90% success rate, which is, amazing. I don't know. I'm really proud of our ladies, and I'm really excited that we have the support to continue this type of programming. Okay, so how do we get help for this program? We need partnerships. So community agencies, we are doing the footwork. We get out there, we go have coffee, we go meet people, we introduce ourselves, give out cards, allow ourselves to be available to community members. We go through training, so we're trauma informed. We use gender specific servicing. We're not putting women in classes with men or women in classes with people who maybe they have been abused by. We are paying attention to those relationships. And then we're giving people a chance through this program because this is a prison diversion program. So they're looking at Department of Corrections or Community Corrections or FOP or drug court. So we're giving them an opportunity, but we're also holding them accountable throughout that time. And I think that's it. Click? That's it. Okay. Thanks.
Awesome. Lauren, where else in the state are you guys looking at implementing that?
So FOP is a state program.
It is,
so,
everywhere in the state.
It is a statewide program. Districts have it, many probation districts, but some of the more rural districts who have lower levels of resources do not.
Okay. And I know that there are areas of overlap, I know, from the defense side where our social workers are also interested in helping the clients stay on parole because it's in their interest, or probation rather. And I was wondering whether you have ever collaborated with the defense or a social worker, or if not, what would be helpful to you in doing that?
So defense attorneys will regularly contact me before sentencing and say, hey, can you go to the jail and meet with this girl because she's got sentencing, in a couple weeks, and we want to see if she's appropriate. And so that's the biggest piece, is getting them through screening and seeing if they are appropriate. If they're not appropriate, they can't come into the program, we'll make them so much worse. And then with social workers, just having releases of information so that we can collaborate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Sure. Christy, I had a question for you. You kind of hinted at that one good topic to talk about would be how you resource communities. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you do that, particularly to address racial disparities and ethnic disparities.
I'm going to disaggregate those 2 questions.
Okay.
Because I think... So my favorite place to take money. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting comfortable. I was comfortable, Kim. There's a handout that went around, right, called Transforming Safety, which is an initiative we worked on last year. And it's based on a model called justice reinvestment. So in our world, in the decarceration world, this is kind of a hot little thing, right? So the idea being, there are things we do, it's very simple, actually. There are things we do in criminal justice that don't work and cost a lot of money. So if you check both those boxes, then stop doing the stuff that doesn't work, but capture those savings and reinvest them, right, into strategies that work. This has been a big thing through DOJ, and they've been Department of Justice, and they've been rolling this out. The way that Justice Reinvestment sort of 1.0 has been designed, has really about then reinvesting that back into the criminal justice system for system improvement. You know, so we'll fund more FOP, so we'll have better outcomes, and then you'll save money, and then, so that's how it's kind of pitched politically. CCJRC takes a very different approach to that, which is we want to capture that funding and put it into the community, right, not into systems. I'm not saying systems improvement isn't valuable, it isn't valid, that you can't have amazing results. It's just not our role, right? We're a community-based organization. Our emphasis and priorities on community development. So transforming safety, and what it did is it coupled in a crime prevention initiative parole reforms, which reduced the amount of time people could go back to prison on a technical parole violation, and is piloting a crime prevention initiative in both North Aurora and Southeast Colorado Springs that is coupling both small business lending for economic development and a community grant program to provide services aimed at crime prevention. So what we're hoping to do with this is to demonstrate that the community can actually play a pretty significant role in public safety. We're not often seen as public safety players, but there was an article that just came out of the New York Times, and a researcher out at NYU that just put out a book that has documented the impact that community-based organizations had in dropping the crime rate in New York. We keep thinking it's broken windows, it's changes in policing strategies, is this, that, and the other thing within a system, and that may have an impact. What his research is showing is that the biggest bang for the buck in bringing those numbers down was the expansion of community-based organizations that were serving their community. So my favorite place is to raid the Department of Corrections budget, which is what I have an incredible proficiency and passion for. And so we have $4 million a year coming out of the prison budget that's going to fund these two initiatives in North Aurora for the next 3 years, and with a lot of evaluation and all that kind of stuff that's on top of it. What we didn't want that to be was a local government grant program. Right, so what we did is we designed it so in that intermediate, and we sort of really learned a lot from kind of what we did in House Bill 1355 and injecting sort of the Latino coalition as the intermediary, because that role is so valuable. And so we said, okay, so if we're going to do a place-based, right, because this would be part of our critique, in addition to sort of sometimes doing crappy services, right? We care, but we can fall short on the research. My critique on some of the nonprofit and social services approaches is we have a tendency to chase the problem. You know, and I get in trouble for saying this, but we'll chase fat kids, and we'll chase and so everyone runs over there and does that, and then we run over here and we do that, and then funders change their mind, and then we have to backtrack and say, okay, we got to redesign, and we're exhausted, right? Trying to build programs that meet funders' priorities and not community priorities. So we said we're not going to do it that way. So the Denver Foundation was actually selected as the intermediary to manage the grant portion of it. They're partnering with the Pikes Peak Community Foundation in Colorado Springs. Both communities are developing a local planning team of local residents, including law enforcement and faith leaders and community leaders and residents and ex-cons and crime survivors and small business leaders, people, the fabric of the community. They are developing what the crime prevention priorities are. We're in that process right now with both Aurora and Colorado Springs. Those will wrap up by the end of February. Once both communities are positioned to make independent, Colorado Springs can be different than Aurora. And then once they've developed what their crime prevention priorities are, then that gets translated into the grant guidelines, right? So we're flipping the script in terms of how you drive decision-making up and money down. And so those first round of the grant, Denver Foundation will develop the grant proposal, guidelines, portals, and all that stuff that they have to do to manage this. But that should be open in early March. Grants will roll out in June, and then it will repeat and repeat. and repeat. So we're very excited about that. And we utilize this community development financial institutions, which are your microlenders. If you don't know about these guys, you should know about these guys. These are rock stars, right? Because they specialize in small business lending. They'll do a loan for $100 to $500 to $50,000 to $1 million bucks, depending on who they are, right? But they specialize in small business. They specialize, and they're used to working with people in low-income communities. That's why they were created. So anyway, I'll blather on about that, but this idea of how do you, from an infrastructure, right, from an infrastructure perspective, engage the community, right, not systems. And so that's that thing. The reason why I'm going to disaggregate is because I know, and any of you should know, just resourcing community of colors is not going to reduce racial disparity because that's not what their problem is. Right?
Yep.
So if we want to confront racial disparity, we have to have a whole different conversation and set of strategies. Stop trying to make black and brown people better as a way of thinking you're going to dismantle racism in the criminal justice system. It's not, right?
Thank you.
So let's stop trying to conflate that this is really about, disadvantaged people getting involved in criminal activity, and that's why we have racial disparity. This is a legacy, long legacy, and it needs to be dismantled in a way that's not just service focused.
Thank you.
Done. Now sit back.
Nice work.
I get paid for this.
I know.
I'm here on Thursday.
Richard, I'm going to pose this question to you, and then there's another one that's up on the board for Lauren. But Richard, which laws need to be changed to be created to make your programs even more successful? If you can answer.
I'm not sure. There's probably a lot of different laws of the collateral consequences that get in the way of individuals actually moving past that experience.
Mm-hmm.
But for the program to be successful, I think it needs to be going on the current trajectory that it's going on, is appropriately resourcing them, getting them stable, developing the organizations, and really finding that niche within the community that they fit. Because them, in and of themselves, can't fix all of these different things. We're going to need to be a part of that puzzle, but we're not alone in that puzzle. So when looking at the different laws, I mean, between the jurisdictions, sometimes they're so different and works one thing here and it's another thing there. Not allowing people to return to different places because their crime was in this community, even though they have no family, they have no housing, but we're going to release them homeless in that community because that's where they offended, rather than letting them change to a jurisdiction where they could go and be housed. So there's a lot of different things that we encounter, but it's a pretty big field.
Yeah. Kevin, do you mind if I, please? I get really stressed out when I hear about new laws being created. I'm not sure about anybody else, but it really stresses me out. I don't know that there's any law that could be created that's going to make a program work. It just doesn't work that way. Now, reducing some laws, taking things that are impeding programs from working, absolutely. But please stop creating laws to make things work. It just doesn't work that way. The programs that Latino Coalition is involved in, they'll work if partners come to the table, partners like us come to the table and say, how can we increase practices? And people like Christy say, how can we reduce policy impediments? But creating new laws to make things work isn't the way to go. It just creates more impediments, more silos, more problems and challenges down the road because of the unintended consequences.
Although this program was built and from a new law.
Yeah, you got money for the new law, absolutely. I will say that, right? The funding has to come from some kind of initiative or legislation. But for instance, there's been talk that I see an implementation science person in the room, and I think the deputy DA talked about it. I'm an implementation researcher. That's a lot of what I do. You can't legislate implementation practice. You can't legislate good implementation of programs, but people try to do it all the time, and that just creates more impediments, right? You just have good implementation because you have good practitioners, you have good leaders, you have good programs. Creating a legislation-based initiative to do that isn't going to work. It just creates problems.
Lauren, how do you work with trans women and trans women of color as they experience the criminal justice system differently than cis?
So for our specific programs, there's only a couple of things that are must-dos, and that is that they have to meet with their probation officer every week because it's a maximum client until phase 2, which is every other week. And then they have to meet with a therapist or have, okay, so it can be a therapist in 2 groups or it can be 3 therapeutic contacts. So if I get a transgender woman who's coming in, she can link up with whatever services she's comfortable with linking up with. She can choose her therapy provider. She can choose what pro-social contacts she has in the community. We have LGBTQA resource packets for them to go through when they come in. But it's really all about choice and promoting that empowerment to make their own path. They do have to, engage in some of the programming, like the victim impact and the trauma groups, but really they can choose the other things that they do to tailor the programming to fit their individual needs.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody from the audience want to ask any questions?
Yeah. Hi. My question is about, it's up there. I wonder if you find, Christy and Richard, like ways that the criminal justice system is making the community-based programs that you support, like, falter or putting up barriers for you? Like, are they getting in your way? And I think that maybe that's kind of where the, like, what laws need to be changed question might be coming from, is like, are you seeing that? And if so, how do you think, like, we could get around the barriers that the criminal justice system, like, kind of sets? Well, no, we have to do our thing, first. You're seeing it and how we fix it.
Why don't you start with the good news, and then I'll tell you the bad news.
All right. Well, so the good news is that from our experience with the Department of Corrections, when we first, Christy was running the law and all those things we were doing, they said, okay, good, you get to work with the Department of Corrections. On the outside, I was smiling, but on the inside, I was frowning. I was like, oh no, what's this going to look like? But I was so incredibly pleasantly surprised because at a leadership level, fundamentally, they recognized that this was a direction that they needed to go. And they made it very clear that that's what the expectation was being set. But what we're running into is culture. Mm-hmm. So that cultural piece of we're here to protect the public and these are all bad people. And the way to do that is to keep them in prisons. So that cultural piece is incredibly strong. And so navigating some of that, working through some of that, at first it was kind of like they didn't want anything to do with us. But we really broke down those silos by really getting engaged at a person-to-person level of doing joint case staffings, of talking through the problems, talking about the people. Accountability from the top down was huge. And then also some of the hiring practice that the Department of Corrections started to do. They started looking for people that were really wanting to help people change. And not this whole, no, I just need to keep them in a cage mentality. So we've been really, really fortunate here, and I continue to see that trajectory going up. So that's the good news. I'll let Christy share the bad.
And Johanna is here, she was here, maybe she left, from the Department of Corrections, and her leadership in helping this happen, and because it did not start off as a good news story for the Department of Corrections, right? So when we came up with the idea, and as you guys might remember, so the history on this was, Tom Clements was murdered by a man on parole. And if you didn't know Tom, he was amazing. And he was a real gift. He was the director of the Department of Corrections. He came in from Missouri. And he was murdered in the front foyer of his home. And it devastated a lot of people, including us. And so there was a lot of interest and effort to say, what can we do as a legislative body, right? They were like, because they always want to jump in and think they're the solution. Because that's all they do all day long, that's what they do, that's their job. But they were very sincere in wanting to do this. So the governor had essentially written a $10 million blank check to DOC and just said, do something to improve parole outcomes, right? And so we looked at that, and it's all inside the system, right? It's more parole officers, it's more parole officers inside prisons, and it went on, and they had all these FTE and all equipment increases and improvements and all that kind of stuff, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, this is horseshit, right? If you want to improve the reentry and successful reentry, there has got to be a partnership with the community, right? So we went to a proposal with the interim who had come in after Tom was murdered, and had a conversation. He's sort of like, that's interesting, okay, and blew us off, right? And so we're like, okay, folks, and they kind of like blew it off. It's so foreign. Rushan, this idea is so foreign. This idea that you could actually build a partnership with shared resources and shared power, right? That's the model, right? And so people couldn't wrap, because we're so used to these silos, like, you're over there, and maybe we'll refer to you, but what does that braiding look like? Because it's not an easy space because of some of the culture and all of that that's really different. And so DOC, and I'm not talking about any of the line staff in DOC, I'm talking about more sort of people that get engaged in the legislative level, didn't really want anything to do with it. So we hijacked $8 million out of their budget to get their attention, right? And then we negotiated from that in the creation of that. And we got called into the governor's office. I got screamed at by the executive director that you won't tell me what to do with my department. That's how it started. And when I finally cut through and I said, all we want to do is be your partner, he was like, oh, okay, I get that. And then we could start, right? Then we could really start to say, what would that partnership look like? And what would need to happen to make that work? And can we talk about ex-cons being case managers? Can we talk about, like, no, you leave us alone, you be you, let us be us. We're not you, we're not gonna be you. Don't try and ask us to be you. And we're not gonna ask you to be us. And then having somebody as competent as this human being navigate that and help build those bridges and those relationships. So now you have community groups who used to hate the Department of Corrections, literally, and the people in the Department of Corrections who thought we were a bunch of flakes, couldn't follow through, blah, 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 right? All the critiques, some well-placed, some well-placed, working it together. Joint case management. But it didn't start that way. Because a lot of people within the department who were in the field of reentry thought we were competing with. That's why I don't like the language of competing with, right? We're competitors of. No, we're partners. You do you, and if we can get your boundaries back over where they belong, create some space for us to do our special sauce with competency, we might actually see something better in communities that are struggling and deserve solutions. That's my thing. Okay. I'm all fired up today.
Thank you so much to all of you. Just want to thank all of us throughout the day and our moderators and respondents for helping to really bring this subject to life. And I hope that, I think a lot of them, most of them are sticking around throughout the room and will be here as we open up the bar. I kind of caught these three themes out of today, and I know there were more, but the first one being that we really need to think about early, accurate, and non-biased assessment so that we can measure risk and do minimally invasive procedures in our criminal justice system. And then we also really need to think about how we can resource what we want to happen and not resource what we don't want to happen. So I appreciate all of you being here. I really want to also thank my doc students, Tyler and Seema, and MSW student, Carolyn, who've been helping me get ready for this day. And we have a ton of social work students. Michelle over here is working with ADC, with Kevin. We have a ton of students who are really interested in working with the criminal justice system as social workers. And by system, I mean with with justice problems. I don't even know. I need a new word for that.
Like
maybe
justice-involved individuals, maybe? Is that what you're asking?
I don't know. Just who are interested in working to find new solutions to this problem that maybe aren't criminal justice system solutions, but maybe also are. So both of those things. So I just want to encourage all of you to think of us as a resource, or students as a resource, and think about us as a partner in this work, and let us know what you need. All right, so that's the end of my pages. So please stay for a drink and ask your unasked questions. I'm going to put one more poll up on the board. Lauren, will you click a couple times? One more. And yeah, so tell us one new thing you learned at today's event. And if before you leave, you'll send something on your handy cell phone, you can even text it to GSSW to 37607. It would make me happy. Thank you so much. Hope to see you soon.
Allison, Glenn's wife.
Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I can't remember the last time I chatted with him. I wanted to get some ideas for
Here's the problem is we've got all of these evidence-based
But I
practices
haven't talked to him in so
and
long.
the terminology and all this stuff is so foreign. None of our people can get our head around it.
That's really good to
So they
hear.
developed that curriculum, and we've done it out in LA, we've done it here.
Have you been working with Brandon and his people? Is he a student I had trouble like a million years ago?
Voilà, ils sont curieux, on se regarde et on passe en là.